Sir, if they come, hide my sister. Those were the last words 13-year-old Eli whispered before collapsing on Jonas Hale's porch, his blood pooling on the weathered wood. Behind him, smoke rose from his burning home. 5 killers were coming, hunting for the boy and his little sister like animals. Jonas Hale had sworn never to kill again. But when evil rides up to your door demanding innocent blood, some vows are meant to be broken. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The Montana Territory had a way of swallowing men whole. It stretched endless and unforgiving beneath skies so vast they made a man feel like nothing more than a speck of dust caught between heaven and earth. Out here, the land didn't care who you'd been before. Soldier, outlaw, saint, or sinner. It just took what it wanted and left the rest to bleach under the sun. Jonas Hale had learned that lesson the hard way. His cabin sat at the edge of Cottonwood Ridge, a lonely structure of timber and stone that looked like it had grown straight out of the Montana soil. It wasn't much. A single room with a loft, a stone fireplace that smoked when the wind shifted, and a porch that creaked under a man's weight. But it was his, and after everything he'd seen, everything he'd done, that was enough. The sun was making its slow descent behind the western ridges, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep crimson. Jonas sat on that creaking porch, a cup of bitter coffee cooling in his hands, watching the light fade like it did every evening. The ritual was the same. Coffee at sunset, silence until dark, then sleep that never quite came. He'd been following this routine for 3 years now, ever since he'd left the cavalry and the ghosts that came with it. The war was over. He'd made sure of that when he rode away from Fort Benton with his discharge papers and a promise to himself, never again. Never again would he point a rifle at another human being. Never again would he hear the sound of men screaming as they died. Never again would he wake up with their faces burned into his memory. But the Montana Territory had other plans. Jonas heard them before he saw them, footsteps on the dirt path leading up to his cabin, uneven and desperate. He set down his coffee and reached for the rifle that leaned against the porch rail. Old habits died hard, even for men trying to bury their past. The footsteps grew louder, punctuated by ragged breathing and what sounded like sobbing. Jonas stood slowly, his hand steady on the rifle, his eyes fixed on the bend in the path where the cottonwood trees cast long shadows across the ground. Then he saw him. A boy stumbled into view, no more than 13 years old, his clothes torn and soaked with blood. He clutched his left shoulder with his right hand, but the blood seeped through his fingers in steady pulses that meant the wound was deep. His face was pale as milk, his eyes wide with terror and pain, and he moved with the jerky, desperate motions of someone running on nothing but willpower. Behind him, smoke rose into the evening sky. Not the thin, friendly smoke of a cooking fire, but thick black columns that spoke of destruction. Jonas was off the porch before he'd made a conscious decision to move, the rifle forgotten as he caught the boy just as his legs gave out. The kid was heavier than he looked, solid farm muscle beneath the blood and fear, and Jonas had to brace himself to keep them both from going down. "Easy now," Jonas said, his voice rough from disuse. "I got you." The boy's eyes focused on him with desperate intensity. His lips moved, forming words that took everything he had left to speak. "Sir?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "If they come, hide my sister." Then the boy's eyes rolled back, and he went limp in Jonas's arms. For a moment, Jonas stood frozen, the weight of the unconscious child in his grip, the smell of smoke in his nostrils, and a cold certainty settling in his gut. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this deliberately, and they were coming. He carried the boy inside, kicking the door shut behind him, and laid him on the narrow bed against the far wall. The wound in the shoulder was bad, a deep gash that looked like it had been made by a knife, or maybe a hatchet. The bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped, and the boy's breathing was shallow and quick. Jonas had treated enough battlefield wounds to know what needed doing. He grabbed his medical kit, a battered leather pouch he'd kept from his cavalry days, and set to work. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, stitched it closed with practiced efficiency that made his hands shake with unwanted memories, and bandaged it tight with strips of clean cloth. The whole time his mind was working through the implications. The boy had said they, plural, and he'd said if they come, which meant they were following. Hunting. The smoke on the horizon told the rest of the story. A homestead burned, a family attacked, and at least one survivor who'd managed to run. One survivor he could see. But the boy had mentioned a sister. Jonas finished with the bandage and stood, looking down at the unconscious child. The kid's face was peaceful now, the terror smoothed away by unconsciousness. He looked young, too young for whatever hell he'd been running from. Jonas moved to the window and looked out at the darkening landscape. The smoke was clearer now, rising from a spot about 2 miles east, near where the Miller property used to be. Or maybe it was the Henderson place. He'd made a point of not getting to know his neighbors too well. That was the whole point of living out here. Distance from humanity and the violence it brought. But now that violence had followed a bleeding child to his door, he grabbed his rifle, checked that it was loaded, and stepped back onto the porch. The sun had dropped below the ridgeline now, leaving the world caught in that strange twilight that wasn't quite day and wasn't quite night. Shadows stretched long and dark across the valley floor. Jonas scanned the tree line, his eyes moving with the methodical precision of a scout. Nothing moved, no riders, no sounds except the evening wind through the cottonwoods and the distant cry of a hawk. But they were coming. He could feel it in his bones. The sister. The boy had begged him to hide the sister. Jonas stepped off the porch and moved quickly toward the creek that ran behind his property. If the girl had survived, if she'd run in the same direction as her brother, she might have made it this far. The creek provided cover, cottonwood trees, brush, and hollows in the bank, where a small person could hide. He moved through the dying light like a ghost, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. The rifle was comfortable in his hands, despite his years away from military life. Some things you never forgot, no matter how hard you tried. He found her by the old oak tree where the creek bent south. She was tiny, couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, curled up in a hollow beneath the oak's massive roots. Her dress was torn and dirty, her face streaked with tears and ash, and she held a rag doll clutched so tight against her chest that her knuckles were white. When Jonas approached, she pressed herself deeper into the hollow, her eyes going wide with terror. "It's all right," Jonas said softly, stopping several feet away and crouching down to make himself smaller. "Your brother sent me. Eli, that's his name, isn't it?" The girl's eyes flickered with recognition at her brother's name. "He's at my house," Jonas continued, keeping his voice gentle and low. "He's hurt, but he's going to be okay. He told me to find you, to keep you safe, so—" "Is Eli dead?" The question came out small and broken, and it nearly tore Jonas's heart in two. "No, honey, he's alive. He's tough, your brother, tough as they come." "Mama and Papa are dead." It wasn't a question. The girl said it with the flat certainty of someone who'd seen it happen. Jonas felt that old familiar rage building in his chest, the same rage that had gotten him through the war and nearly destroyed him afterward. He swallowed it down and extended his hand toward the girl. "What's your name?" "Annie." "Annie, I'm Jonas, and I promise you nobody's going to hurt you or your brother while I'm breathing, but we need to get back to my cabin before dark. Can you do that?" Annie studied him with those wide, dark eyes. She was evaluating him, weighing whether to trust this stranger against whatever horrors she'd just escaped. Finally, she nodded and took his hand. Her fingers were ice cold despite the warm evening. Jonas picked her up. She weighed almost nothing, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, still clutching the rag doll between them. He could feel her shaking as he carried her back toward the cabin, and he found himself murmuring reassurances that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "It's going to be all right. You're safe now. I've got you." But even as he said the words, he knew they might be lies. Because somewhere out there in the gathering darkness, the men who'd killed this child's parents and tried to kill her brother were still hunting, and Jonas had just made himself their next target. They made it back to the cabin as the last light faded from the sky. Jonas set Annie down on the porch and took one more look at the horizon. The smoke was barely visible now, just a dark smudge against the darkening sky. But something else caught his attention. Movement on the eastern ridge, silhouetted against what remained of the sunset. Riders. 4, maybe 5 of them, moving slow and deliberate along the ridgeline. They were coming. Jonas ushered Annie inside and barred the door. The girl ran immediately to her brother's side, climbing onto the bed and taking Eli's hand in hers. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't make a sound. "Is he going to wake up?" she whispered. "Soon," Jonas said, hoping it was true. The boy had lost a lot of blood, and shock was a killer all on its own. But he was young and strong, and Jonas had seen men survive worse. Jonas moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, preparing for what was coming. He checked his ammunition, 2 boxes of rifle cartridges, maybe 60 rounds total. His revolver hung on a peg by the door, fully loaded with 6 rounds and 2 more speed loaders on his gun belt. Not much, but it would have to do. He filled his canteen and set it by the window along with a spare rifle and ammunition. He doused the lamp, leaving the cabin in darkness broken only by the faint red glow from the fireplace. Then he took up position by the window that faced east, the direction the riders had been coming from. Annie watched him from the bed, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Are they coming?" she asked. Jonas wanted to lie, wanted to tell her everything would be fine, that those men would pass by, that morning would come and bring safety with the sun, but this girl had already seen too much to believe comfortable lies. "Yes," he said simply, "they're coming." "Are you going to fight them?" Jonas looked at the rifle in his hands, the same rifle he'd sworn never to use against another human being, the same rifle that represented everything he'd tried to leave behind. "If I have to." "My papa fought them," Annie said, her voice small and distant. "They killed him anyway." Jonas turned from the window to look at her. "Your papa was protecting you and Eli. That's what fathers do. That's what men do when evil comes knocking." "But they still killed him." "Yes," Jonas said, "but you and your brother are alive, which means your papa won." Annie thought about that for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She lay down next to her brother, still holding his hand, and closed her eyes. Jonas turned back to the window and waited. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. The moon rose, casting silver light across the valley floor. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters and making the cottonwood trees whisper secrets to the night. Jonas's eyes burned from staring into the darkness, but he didn't dare look away. Somewhere out there, men with blood on their hands were hunting children. Around 10 o'clock, Eli stirred and groaned. Jonas moved quickly to the bed and found the boy's eyes fluttering open. "Easy," Jonas said, putting a hand on the boy's good shoulder. "Don't try to move too fast." Eli's eyes focused on him with difficulty. "Annie, right here." The little girl sat up, tears streaming down her face again. "I'm here, Eli." The boy's hand found hers and squeezed. "You're okay?" "Jonas found me. He saved me." Eli's eyes shifted to Jonas, and in them, Jonas saw a depth of pain and grief that no 13-year-old should have to carry. "They killed them," Eli whispered. "Ma and Pa. They rode up and—" "Don't," Jonas said firmly. "Don't go back there right now. You need to rest and heal." "But they're coming. They'll find us." "Let them come." Eli tried to sit up, winced, and fell back. "You don't understand. There's 5 of them. They're not just outlaws. They're hunters. They enjoy it." "I faced worse," Jonas said, though he wasn't sure that was true. "Who are you?" Eli asked, studying Jonas's face in the firelight. "You move like a soldier. Talk like one, too." "I was. Long time ago." "Then you know. You know what men like that are capable of." Jonas nodded slowly. "I do." "And you're still going to stand against them? For us?" Jonas looked at the 2 children, the injured boy trying to be brave, the terrified girl holding her brother's hand like it was the only solid thing in a world gone mad. He thought about the promise he'd made to himself 3 years ago, about the vow to never again take up arms against another human being. Then he thought about what would happen to these kids if he kept that vow. "Yes," he said simply, "I'm going to stand." Eli's eyes filled with tears. "Why? You don't even know us." Jonas was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer that. The truth was complicated. The truth involved ghosts and guilt and a desperate need to prove to himself that he was still a man worth saving. But these kids didn't need complicated truths. "Because somebody has to," he finally said. It was almost midnight when Jonas heard the hoofbeats. They came slow and deliberate, no attempt at stealth. 5 riders emerging from the darkness like death incarnate, their horses' hooves striking the ground in a rhythm that seemed deliberately menacing. Jonas positioned himself at the window, rifle ready, and watched them come. They stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, just at the edge of the moonlight. Jonas could make out their silhouettes. 5 men on horseback, sitting easy in their saddles, with the confidence of predators who'd never met anything they couldn't kill. The one in the center nudged his horse forward a few steps. Even in the darkness, Jonas could tell this was the leader. He sat straighter than the others, and there was something in the way he moved that spoke of intelligence and cruelty in equal measure. "Hello, the house." The voice was smooth and cultured, almost friendly. It was the kind of voice that belonged to a school teacher or a preacher, not a killer. That made it more dangerous. Jonas said nothing. "Now I know someone's in there," the man continued. "I saw smoke from your chimney earlier, and I'm betting you've got something that belongs to me." Still, Jonas remained silent. "2 children," the man said, "a boy and a girl. Their parents were uncooperative about a business matter. But kids don't need to die over their parents' mistakes. We just want to have a conversation with them. Make sure they understand how things are going to be from now on." Jonas felt his finger tighten on the rifle trigger. Every instinct screamed at him to put a bullet through this man's lying mouth. But he forced himself to breathe, to think, to not give away his position. "Tell you what," the man said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone. "You send out the kids, and we'll ride away. No harm to you. You've got my word on that." Behind Jonas, Annie whimpered softly. Eli's hand found hers and held tight. "The word of a child killer," Jonas said, finally breaking his silence. His voice carried clearly across the distance. "Not worth the breath it takes to speak it." There was a moment of surprised silence. Then the leader laughed, and it was a genuinely amused sound. "A philosopher, out here in the middle of nowhere. My. The man's tone changed, hardened. "Let me be clear then. You're harboring fugitives. That makes you an accessory to theft and murder. Only murder I know about is the one you committed tonight. Those people were thieves. They stole from my employer. The penalty for that is death. Simple as that. And the children? Witnesses. Can't have witnesses." At least he was honest about it. Jonas had to give him that. "What's your name?" Jonas asked. "Cal Garrett. And you are?" "The man between you and those kids." Another laugh from Garrett. "1 man, against 5. Those aren't good odds, friend." "Depends on the man." Jonas could almost feel Garrett's smile in the darkness. "You a soldier?" Garrett asked. "You sound like military." "Used to be." "Which side?" "Does it matter?" "I suppose not. The war's over. We're all Americans now, right?" Garrett's horse shifted beneath him. "But here's the thing, soldier. This isn't a war. This is business. Cold, practical business. Those kids' parents made a mistake. They paid for it. Now the kids need to understand that mistakes have consequences. After that, well, we'll see." "We'll see means they're already dead," Jonas said flatly. "Probably," Garrett admitted. "But that's not your concern. Your concern is staying alive, which you will do if you're smart and send them out." "No." The single word hung in the air between them. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, the friendliness was gone from his voice. "You understand what you're doing. You're choosing to die for 2 children you don't even know. Children who are already dead, they just don't know it yet. We'll get them tonight, tomorrow, next week. Doesn't matter. We always get what we're paid for. Then you're going to have to come through me to get them." "That can be arranged." Jonas watched as Garrett turned his horse and rode back to his men. There was a brief conference, too quiet to hear, and then all 5 riders wheeled their horses and disappeared back into the darkness. Jonas waited, rifle ready, but they didn't return. After several minutes, he heard hoofbeats fading into the distance, heading back east. He didn't relax. Men like Garrett didn't give up that easily. "Are they gone?" Annie's voice was trembling. "For now," Jonas said. He turned from the window and looked at the 2 children. Eli was sitting up now despite the pain it obviously caused him, his arm around his sister. They looked at Jonas with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "That man, Garrett," Eli said. He worked for Mr. Blackwood, the banker in Prescott. Jonas felt a chill run down his spine. Calvin Blackwood was one of the richest men in Montana Territory, with interests in banking, mining, and land speculation. He was also known for being absolutely ruthless in protecting those interests. "What did your parents do?" Jonas asked. Eli's face twisted with grief and anger. "Nothing. They didn't do nothing. Mr. Blackwood wanted our land, said he needed it for a railroad right-of-way. Pa refused to sell, said it was our home, and no amount of money was worth losing your home." The boy's voice cracked. 2 weeks ago, Blackwood sent papers saying Pa had taken a loan using the land as collateral. But it was a lie. Pa never borrowed nothing from nobody. He tried to fight it legal-like, went to the sheriff, but the sheriff said the papers looked official. So Blackwood sent Garrett. They showed up tonight just after supper. Said we had 1 hour to clear out or they'd burn us out. Pa tried to reason with them, tried to explain it was all a lie. Garrett just... Eli couldn't continue. Annie picked up the story, her voice flat and mechanical. "He shot Papa." Just like that. Mama screamed and they shot her too. Eli grabbed me and we ran out the back. They chased us, but Eli, he fought one of them. Cut him with Papa's knife. She looked at her brother with fierce pride. "That's how he got hurt. The man hit him with something, but Eli didn't let go of me. He dragged me into the woods and told me to run while he led them away. But I followed him instead. I followed him here." Jonas felt the rage building again, hot and familiar. This was what he'd tried to escape. The casual evil of men who could murder parents in front of their children over a piece of land. The kind of evil that had made him sick of soldiering, sick of killing, sick of being part of a world where might made right. But here it was again, knocking on his door, demanding innocent blood. And this time, he couldn't walk away. "Listen to me," Jonas said, his voice firm and steady. "Both of you. Those men are going to come back. Probably tonight. Definitely before dawn. They'll come in force, and they'll come ready for a fight. I need you to understand something. I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe. Everything. But I need you to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, without questions. Can you do that?" Both children nodded. "Good. Now, Eli, you're hurt bad. You can't fight, so I need you to focus on protecting your sister. Under this cabin, there's a root cellar. It's got a tunnel that leads out to the creek bed about 30 yards away. If things go bad up here, if I tell you to run, you take Annie and you go through that tunnel. You follow the creek south until you hit the main road. Then you run to Prescott and you find the sheriff. His name is Tom Brennan. You tell him what happened. You tell him about Blackwood and Garrett. And you tell him Jonas Hale died, making sure you survived. Understand?" "Jonas?" Eli started to protest. "Do you understand?" Jonas's voice cut through the boy's words like a blade. "Yes, sir." "Good." Jonas moved to the corner of the room and rolled back the worn rug that covered the floor. Underneath was a trapdoor. He pulled it open to reveal a ladder leading down into darkness. "Get down there now. Take a lamp. Some food from the shelf. There's blankets down there. Make yourselves as comfortable as you can." "What about you?" Annie asked. Jonas looked at the little girl with her tear-streaked face and her rag doll and her eyes that had seen too much horror for one night. "I'll be right up here," he said gently, "and I promise you, nobody's going to hurt you while I'm standing." The children climbed down into the cellar. Jonas closed the trapdoor and rolled the rug back over it. Then he went back to his position by the window and resumed his vigil. The Montana night stretched out before him, vast and dark and full of deadly promise. Somewhere out there, 5 killers were planning their next move. And Jonas Hale, the man who'd sworn never to kill again, was preparing to break that vow. He thought about the war, about all the men he'd killed in the name of duty and country, about the faces that haunted his dreams and the voices that whispered accusations in the dark. He'd spent 3 years trying to atone for that violence, trying to prove he could be something other than a killer. But maybe that's all he'd ever been. Maybe that's all he'd ever be. Maybe God had put him out here, in this lonely cabin at the edge of nowhere, so he'd be in the right place when 2 desperate children needed someone willing to stand between them and evil. Or maybe he was just a broken man looking for redemption in all the wrong places. Either way, when Cal Garrett came riding back with murder in his heart, Jonas Hale would be waiting. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, heavy with memory and purpose, and the terrible weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. Outside, the wind picked up, and the cottonwood trees whispered their secrets to the darkness. The moon sailed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley floor. And Jonas Hale watched and waited, a solitary figure standing between innocence and evil, between life and death, between the man he'd been and the man he was about to become again. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound rose and fell, lonely and mournful, echoing across the empty miles. It was the sound of the Montana Territory itself, beautiful and brutal, unforgiving and eternal. Jonas checked his ammunition one more time, then settled in to wait for dawn or death, whichever came first. The fire at Cottonwood Ridge was about to begin. The hours before dawn were the longest Jonas had ever known. He sat motionless by the window, every sense heightened, listening to the night sounds of the Montana Territory. The wind through the cottonwoods, the distant cry of a nightbird, the creak of his cabin settling, and beneath it all, the thundering of his own heartbeat, marking time until violence arrived. Around 2 a.m, he heard it, the soft nicker of a horse, quickly silenced. They were back, moving into position under cover of darkness. Jonas's grip tightened on his rifle. He'd been a cavalry scout long enough to recognize the tactics. They'd surround the cabin, wait until just before dawn when a man's guard was lowest, then strike hard and fast. But Jonas wasn't sleeping, and he'd been awake at more dawns than he cared to remember, watching for enemies who wanted him dead. He moved silently away from the window and knelt by the trapdoor. "Eli," he whispered. "You awake down there?" A pause, then the boy's voice came up through the floorboards. "Yes, sir." "They're here, setting up around us. When the shooting starts, you remember what I told you? Take Annie through the tunnel to the creek. That's right, and don't stop. Don't look back, just run." "Mr. Hale." "Jonas, you don't have to do this. We could all go through the tunnel right now, disappear before they know we're gone." Jonas smiled in the darkness. The boy was smart, thinking tactically, even with a wounded shoulder and a murdered father heavy on his heart. But he was also young, and he didn't understand that some things couldn't be run from. "They'd track us by sunrise," Jonas said quietly, "and they'd catch us in the open with nowhere to hide. At least here I've got walls and cover. At least here I've got a chance to thin their numbers before you run." "You keep saying you run, not we run." Jonas didn't answer that. "You're planning to die here, aren't you?" Eli's voice was tight with sudden understanding. "You're going to hold them off so we can escape, and you don't expect to survive it." "I expect to do what needs doing," Jonas said. "The rest is up to God and good shooting." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I've got, son." There was a long silence from below. Then Annie's small voice joined her brother's. "Will it hurt when you die?" The question hit Jonas like a fist to the gut. What kind of world did these children live in where they had to ask such things? "I don't plan on dying," he said, making his voice firm and certain even though his heart knew different. "I plan on making sure you two are safe. That's all that matters." "You're a good man, Jonas Hale," Eli said softly. "Better than most I've known." Jonas closed his eyes against the burn of unexpected tears. "Get some rest while you can, both of you. And remember, when I say run, you run." He moved back to the window before they could respond. The eastern sky was just beginning to show the faintest gray suggestion of dawn. Another hour, maybe less, and the world would be light enough for killing. Jonas had fought in enough battles to know how this would go. Garrett would send 1 or 2 men to probe the cabin's defenses, test Jonas's resolve and position. If Jonas held fire, they'd assume he was bluffing and rush the building. If he shot, they'd know he was serious and get more cautious. Either way, once the shooting started, it wouldn't stop until one side or the other was dead or running. 5 against 1. In an open field, Jonas wouldn't last 5 minutes. But inside this cabin, with limited approaches and good firing positions, he might be able to even the odds. Might. The gray light strengthened. Jonas could make out the shapes of trees now, the outline of the split-rail fence that marked his property line, the dark mass of his small barn. And there, movement near the barn. a shadow detaching itself from other shadows, moving low and quick toward the cabin. Jonas tracked the movement with his rifle but didn't fire. Not yet. Let them get close. Let them commit. The shadow became a man, young, maybe 20, with a rifle in his hands and fear in his movements. He wasn't a professional killer like Garrett. He was probably just a ranch hand or drifter who'd signed on for easy money and was now discovering that murder wasn't as simple as he'd thought. The young man made it to the corner of the cabin and pressed himself against the wall. Jonas could hear him breathing hard, could almost smell his fear through the log walls. The kid was probably supposed to check the windows, see if anyone was awake, report back to Garrett. Jonas let him wait. Let the fear build. Let him wonder if he'd been seen, if a bullet was about to come crashing through the wall and end his life. After what felt like an eternity, the young man worked up his courage and moved along the wall toward the front window, the same window where Jonas sat waiting. Jonas could see him now in the growing light, see the sweat on his face despite the cool morning air, see his hands shaking as he raised up to peer through the glass. Their eyes met. For a frozen moment, they stared at each other, the frightened young gunman and the grim-faced defender. Jonas saw the kid's eyes go wide, saw him start to bring his rifle around. Jonas smashed the rifle butt through the window. Glass exploded outward, and the young man threw himself backward with a shout of alarm. He hit the ground, scrambled to his feet, and ran for the trees, yelling at the top of his lungs. "He's awake! He's armed! He's—" A rifle shot cracked from the tree line, and the young man's shout cut off as he tumbled forward into the dirt. He didn't move again. Jonas felt his blood run cold. They'd shot their own man, killed him just for failing his assigned task, or maybe just to send a message. This was the kind of evil Jonas was dealing with, the kind that valued nothing and no one, not even their own. "Good morning, soldier," Garrett's voice called out from somewhere in the trees. "I see you're an early riser." Jonas said nothing, just scanned the tree line trying to pinpoint the voice. "That was unfortunate," Garrett continued, his tone conversational. "Young Tommy there was nervous. First real job like this. I told him to keep quiet no matter what, but he panicked. Can't have that. Not in my line of work." "Your line of work," Jonas called back, "seems to be murder." "I prefer to think of it as problem solving. Mr. Blackwood has a problem. Those children in your cabin. I'm solving it. They're innocent kids whose parents you murdered. Their parents were thieves and liars. The children are witnesses. Simple mathematics, really. Remove the variables, solve the equation." Jonas felt his finger tighten on the trigger. If he had a clear shot at Garrett, he'd take it right now and damn the consequences. But the man was well hidden, probably behind good cover with his remaining men spread out to prevent exactly the kind of ambush Jonas was planning. "Let me propose a solution," Garrett said. "You fought well. You stood your ground like a man of honor, but the situation is untenable. 5 of us, well, 4 now, thanks to your intimidating window smashing, and 1 of you. Those children are going to die today. That's simply a fact. The only question is whether you die with them." "I've heard better offers." Garrett laughed, and there was genuine amusement in the sound. "I imagine you have, but I'm trying to be reasonable here. Walk away, right now. We'll wait until you're out of sight, then we'll do what needs doing, quick and clean. The children won't suffer, you have my word." The word of a man who just shot his own partner. Tommy wasn't my partner, he was an employee who failed to follow orders. There's a difference. Jonas shifted position, moving to a different window. As he did, he caught movement near the barn, another man working his way around to flank the cabin. Jonas raised his rifle and fired. The shot echoed across the valley, and the man dove behind a water trough. Jonas couldn't tell if he'd hit him or not. "That's unfortunate," Garrett said, his voice harder now. "I was hoping we could resolve this peacefully." "You murdered that boy's parents in front of him," Jonas said. "You hunted children through the night like animals. There's nothing peaceful about you, Garrett." "True enough, but I'm good at what I do. And what I do is solve problems completely, which means you, soldier, you've become part of the problem." Jonas saw movement at the corner of his vision, a flash of color near the split-rail fence. He spun and fired. The bullet splintered a fence post, and whoever was there vanished back into cover. "You're a decent shot," Garrett observed. "Military training, I assume." "Which war?" Jonas didn't answer. He was counting. He'd fired twice, which meant He had 18 rounds left in his current box. The man by the barn, that was 1. Whoever was at the fence, that was 2. Garrett somewhere in the trees, 3. And the dead kid made 4 originally, which meant there should be 1 more. Where was number 5? As if in answer to his thought, a bullet punched through the cabin wall 2 feet from Jonas's head. He threw himself flat as 2 more shots followed, splintering the wood where he'd been standing. There. The 5th man was up in the cottonwood tree to the north, using the height for a better angle. Smart. And dangerous. Jonas crawled to the back window and carefully raised his head. He could just make out the shape of a man in the branches, partially concealed by leaves but visible enough for a shot. Jonas steadied his rifle on the windowsill, took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The man in the tree jerked, lost his grip, and fell 20 feet to the ground with a sickening thud. He didn't get up. 3 left, Jonas muttered to himself. Better odds, but still not good. That was Calhoun, Garrett said, and for the first time there was real anger in his voice. He was a friend of mine. We rode together for 6 years. Then you shouldn't have brought him here to murder children. Oh, soldier, you just made this personal. The shooting started in earnest then. Bullets hammered the cabin from 2 directions, the man by the barn and whoever was at the fence. Jonas dropped below the windows as lead punched through walls and shattered glass. Wood splinters filled the air. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Below him, through the floorboards, Jonas could hear Annie screaming. "Stay down!" Jonas shouted toward the trapdoor. "Stay in the cellar!" He rolled to a new position and came up at the eastern window. The man by the barn was reloading, his hands fumbling with cartridges in his haste. Jonas aimed carefully and fired. The bullet caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him behind the trough. The man's rifle fell into the dirt, clearly visible. 2 left, Garrett and the one by the fence. The shooting stopped. Silence fell over the valley, broken only by the groaning of the wounded man by the barn and the ringing in Jonas's ears from the gunfire. "You're better than I thought," Garrett called out. "But you're just delaying the inevitable. You can't watch all directions at once. You'll slip eventually, get tired, make a mistake, and when you do, I'll be waiting." Jonas checked his ammunition, 10 rounds left in the rifle. He reloaded his revolver with steady hands and tried to think tactically. Garrett was right. He couldn't cover every approach. And with daylight strengthening by the minute, they'd be able to see his silhouette through the windows, predict his movements. He needed to change the situation, needed to take the fight to them instead of waiting for them to wear him down. "Eli?" he called down to the cellar. "You still got your father's knife?" "Yes, sir." "Can you throw it?" "Accurately." There was a pause. "Used to practice with Pa. I can hit a tree trunk from 15 feet about half the time. Not great odds, but better than nothing." "Listen carefully," Jonas said. "I'm going to create a distraction. When I do, I need you to come up here quick. We're going to turn the tables on these bastards." "Jonas, I can barely lift my left arm." "You won't need to. Just need you to do exactly what I tell you." Below him, he heard whispered conversation. Eli and Annie arguing in the fierce, desperate way of siblings who'd lost everything but each other. Finally, Eli's voice came back. "All right, what do you need? When I say go, you come up and get ready by the back window. When I give the signal, you open it fast and throw your knife at whoever you see. Don't aim, don't think, just throw hard toward movement and duck back down. Understand?" "That's insane." "That's all we've got. You ready?" Another pause. Then, "Ready." Jonas took a deep breath and stood up in full view of the front window. Immediately, a shot rang out from the fence line, but Jonas was already moving, diving behind the heavy wooden table he'd overturned for cover. The bullet passed through the space where he'd been standing. "Now, Eli!" He heard the trapdoor bang open, heard the boy's quick footsteps despite his wound. Jonas fired 3 shots out the front window toward the fence, keeping whoever was there pinned down. Then he rolled to the side window and fired twice more at the barn, forcing the wounded man to stay behind cover. "Wait for it," Jonas called to Eli. "Wait!" He saw movement in the trees to the north, Garrett finally showing himself, moving to get a better angle on the cabin. The man was good. Jonas had to give him that. He moved like a ghost, using every bit of cover, rifle ready. But he was focused on the front of the cabin, wasn't watching the back. "Go!" Jonas shouted. The back window banged open. Jonas heard Eli's grunt of effort as he threw the knife. Then the boy was diving back down. A split second later, there was a cry of pain from behind the cabin. Not Garrett, but the man at the fence who'd been circling around. Jonas didn't wait to see if the knife had hit anything vital. He burst out the front door, rifle up, and ran straight toward the trees where he'd seen Garrett. The move was so unexpected, so tactically insane, that it bought him 3 precious seconds. He used them well. He hit the tree line, rolled behind a cottonwood trunk, and came up with his rifle trained on where Garrett had been. The man was gone. Jonas's combat instinct screamed at him. He threw himself sideways just as a bullet cracked past his ear. He hit the ground, rolled, came up firing. His shots punched into the tree where Garrett had taken cover. Then they were both moving, circling through the trees, each trying to flank the other. It was a deadly dance Jonas knew well from a dozen battlefields. The first man to make a mistake would be the last man to make any mistake at all. "Bold move, soldier," Garrett's voice came from somewhere to Jonas's right. "Stupid, but bold. Now you're out in the open with me. How does that improve your situation?" Jonas said nothing, just kept moving, using the trees for cover. His mind was racing through calculations. The man by the fence might be dead or wounded from Eli's knife. The man by the barn was definitely wounded, but Garrett was unhurt and armed and clearly knew what he was doing. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," Garrett continued, his voice calm and conversational even as he maneuvered for position. "I'm going to kill you. Then I'm going to walk back to that cabin, and I'm going to find those children, and I'm going to finish what I was paid to finish. The only difference your heroic stand has made is that you're going to die first." Jonas caught movement and fired. The bullet spanged off a tree trunk, and Garrett laughed. "Close, but not quite." Jonas's rifle clicked empty. He dropped it and drew his revolver in one smooth motion, but Garrett had anticipated this. The man stepped out from behind cover 20 yards away, his own rifle trained on Jonas's chest. They stood there in the growing dawn light, each with a clear shot at the other. "Well now," Garrett said softly. "Here we are." Jonas kept his revolver steady, aimed at Garrett's heart. "Here we are." "You know I'm faster than you, don't you? I've done this 100 times. You're good, soldier, but I'm a professional." "Then why are we talking?" Garrett smiled. It was a strange smile, almost respectful. "Because you've impressed me. Most men would have given up the children by now. Most men wouldn't have stood at all. I'm curious about you." "Curiosity won't stop a bullet." "No, but it might delay one long enough for conversation." Garrett shifted his stance slightly, and Jonas's finger tightened on his trigger. "Easy now, just getting comfortable. Tell me, what are those children to you? Family? No? Friends?" "Never met them before last night." Garrett's eyebrows rose. "Truly? Then why? Why throw your life away for strangers?" Jonas thought about how to answer that. The truth was complicated, about guilt and redemption and the ghosts that haunted his sleep. But maybe it was also simple. "Because somebody has to," he said. "Somebody has to," Garrett repeated slowly. "Somebody has to stand between children and death. Somebody has to draw a line in the dirt and say, this far and no further. Somebody has to be the good man in a world full of bad ones. Something like that. And you think that somebody is you? Today it is." Garrett nodded slowly. "You know what's funny? I understand you, I do. You're trying to balance scales, trying to make up for something in your past. Something in the war, maybe. Something that keeps you awake at night." He paused. "But here's the thing. It won't work. Saving those children won't save whoever you failed to save before. The scales don't balance that way." Jonas felt those words hit home like a physical blow. Because Garrett was right. He was thinking about Jenny Dawson and her children, the family in Kansas he'd failed to protect from raiders during the war. He was thinking about how he'd arrived too late, found them dead, and carried that failure in his heart ever since. "Maybe not," Jonas said quietly, "but I can save these two, today, right now. And if I die doing it, at least I'll die trying." Noble sentiment, wrong, but noble. Garrett's eyes hardened. Time for talking is over, soldier. You've got one chance. Throw down that revolver and walk away. I'll even give you a 10-minute head start before I go after the children. Live or die. Choose now. Jonas thought about Eli and Annie in the cellar, thought about their parents murdered in cold blood, thought about how far they'd run and how hard they'd fought to survive, thought about the look in Annie's eyes when she'd asked if dying would hurt. I choose to stand, Jonas said. Garrett sighed. Then you choose to die. Everything happened at once. Both men fired. Jonas felt the hammer of Garrett's bullet hitting his left shoulder, spinning him halfway around. But his own shot had flown true. Garrett staggered backward, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers, a red stain spreading across his chest. Jonas dropped to one knee, his left arm useless, his revolver wavering in his right hand. Garrett sat down hard against a tree trunk, pressing his hand against the wound. Blood leaked between his fingers. Good shot, Garrett wheezed. His face had gone pale, and there was blood on his lips. Better than good. Perfect. Jonas didn't respond. He couldn't seem to catch his breath. The pain in his shoulder was a living thing, hot and terrible. Those children, Garrett coughed, and more blood appeared. They better be worth it. They are. How do you know? Because they're children. That's all that matters. Garrett's eyes were starting to glaze over. Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been doing this too long. Maybe... He coughed again, harder. Maybe you win this one, soldier. Jonas watched as the life faded from Cal Garrett's eyes. The man who'd killed for money, who'd murdered parents and hunted children, who'd lived by the gun and died by the gun. Whatever judgment awaited him beyond this world, Jonas hoped it was just. Then Jonas heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. He tried to turn, tried to bring his revolver around, but his wounded shoulder made him slow, too slow. Don't move. The voice came from behind him. It was the man from the fence, the one Eli had thrown the knife at. He sounded hurt, but very much alive. Drop the gun or I'll shoot you in the spine. Jonas let the revolver fall from his hand. That's smart. Now stand up, slow. Jonas struggled to his feet, his left arm hanging useless, blood soaking through his shirt. He turned slowly and saw the man, middle-aged, weathered face, with a knife wound in his thigh and hatred in his eyes. You killed Garrett, the man said. You killed Tommy and Calhoun. You shot Pete by the barn. You done wrecked everything. Those children are innocent, Jonas said. Don't care if they're saints. I got paid to do a job, and by God, I'm going to finish it. He gestured with the rifle toward the cabin. Walk. We're going to get those kids, and you're going to watch me do it before I kill you. They walked slowly through the trees, the man limping badly from the knife wound, Jonas barely able to stay upright from blood loss and pain. Behind them, Cal Garrett's body slumped against the cottonwood tree, his eyes staring at nothing. They emerged from the tree line into the open ground before the cabin. The sun was fully up now, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. It was going to be a beautiful day. Jonas found himself thinking how wrong that was, how the sun shouldn't shine on days like this. Mr. Hale! Eli's voice came from inside the cabin. Are you all right? Stay in the cellar, Jonas shouted. Don't come out. Shut up, the man with the rifle snarled. He raised his voice. You kids listen up. Your friend here is hurt bad. You want him to live. You come out right now. Silence from the cabin. I'll count to 5. Then I shoot him. 1. Jonas's mind raced. His revolver was back in the trees. The rifle was empty. He had nothing but his own body and whatever seconds remained before that countdown ended. 2. He could rush the man, take the bullet and hope it didn't kill him instantly. Hope that in the few seconds before he died, he could buy the children time to run. 3. Or he could stall, keep the man talking, hope for a miracle he didn't deserve. 4. The trapdoor banged open. Eli climbed out, his face set with grim determination. He held Annie's hand as she came up behind him. Both children walked toward the front door. No, Jonas shouted. Run! Use the tunnel! Can't let you die for us, Eli said simply. Wouldn't be right. The children stepped out onto the porch. Annie still clutched her rag doll. Eli's wounded shoulder was soaked with fresh blood from his exertions. The man with the rifle smiled. It was an ugly smile, full of triumph and cruelty. "That's better. Now?" The shot came from the direction of the barn. The man with the rifle jerked forward, his eyes going wide with shock. He took one step toward the children, then collapsed face first in the dirt. Jonas spun, too fast, the world tilting dangerously from blood loss, and saw the man called Pete standing by the water trough, his rifle smoking, his own blood staining his shirt from Jonas's earlier shot. "Why?" Jonas croaked. Pete lowered his rifle and sat down heavily, his face gray with pain. "Got kids of my own, 2 girls. This ain't right," he coughed. "Ain't never been right. I needed the money. But not for this. Never for this." He closed his eyes and seemed to shrink in on himself. Jonas stood swaying in the morning light, his vision tunneling, his legs refusing to hold him any longer. He saw Eli and Annie running toward him, felt small hands trying to support his weight, heard Annie crying and Eli shouting something Jonas couldn't quite understand. The world was fading, going soft and distant. Maybe this was it. Maybe he'd bought the children enough time with his life. Maybe that was enough. Then another sound cut through the gathering darkness. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, coming fast. Through the haze, Jonas saw riders approaching. His hand fumbled for a weapon he didn't have. After everything, more of Blackwood's men were coming to finish it. But then he heard a voice he recognized. Sheriff Tom Brennan. "Hold on, Jonas, we're here. Just hold on." Jonas felt the ground come up to meet him, felt hands supporting him, laying him down gentle, felt someone pressing cloth against his shoulder wound, heard voices, urgent and concerned, floating above him like birds. "Get him inside. We need to stop this bleeding." "Sheriff, there's dead men everywhere." "Pete's still alive, and he's talking, says Blackwood ordered the whole thing." "What about the children?" "They're scared but unhurt. Boy's got a shoulder wound, but it's been treated. Someone get Doc Morrison out here now." Jonas let his eyes close. He was so tired, so very tired, and he hurt in ways he couldn't even catalog. But through the pain and exhaustion, one thought burned clear and bright. The children were safe. The sheriff was here. It was over. He'd stood between innocence and evil, and somehow, impossibly, he'd held the line. As consciousness faded, Jonas Hale felt something he hadn't felt in 3 long years. Something he'd thought he'd lost forever in the blood and horror of war. Peace. Whatever came next, whatever judgment waited for him in this world or the next, he'd done what needed doing. He'd been the man who stood when standing mattered most. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to balance the scales he'd carried for so long. The last thing he heard before darkness took him was Annie's small voice, fierce and certain through her tears. "He's a hero. He saved us. Don't you let him die." Then the world went away, and Jonas Hale fell into darkness, not knowing if he'd ever wake again. Jonas woke to whiteness and pain. The whiteness was ceiling plaster, cracked and water-stained, with afternoon sunlight slanting across it through a window he couldn't see. The pain was everywhere, his shoulder most of all, but also his ribs, his back, his head. Even breathing hurt, like someone had filled his lungs with ground glass. He tried to move and immediately regretted it. A groan escaped his lips before he could stop it. "Easy now." A woman's voice, calm and professional. Footsteps approached, and a face appeared above him, middle-aged, kind eyes, graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "You've been out for 2 days, Mr. Hale. Your body needs rest, not heroics." "Where?" His voice came out as a croak, his throat raw as sandpaper. "Doc Morrison's clinic in Prescott. Sheriff Brennan brought you in after the fight at your cabin. You lost a lot of blood." She lifted a cup of water to his lips. Small sips, not too fast. The water was the most glorious thing Jonas had ever tasted. He wanted to gulp it down, but the woman, a nurse he assumed, was firm about the small sips. When she finally took the cup away, he found his voice again. "The children, Eli and Annie, are they safe and sound? The boy's shoulder is healing nicely, and the girl hasn't left his side except when the sheriff makes her eat. They've been asking about you constantly." The nurse smiled. That little girl told me in no uncertain terms that if you died, she'd never forgive me, as if I had any say in the matter. Jonas felt something loosen in his chest, some terrible knot of tension he hadn't even known he was carrying. They were alive. After everything, the blood, the bullets, the death, those two children were alive and safe. How bad? He asked, gesturing weakly at his shoulder. Bad enough. The bullet went clean through, missed the bone by about an inch. You'll heal, but that arm's going to give you trouble for months, maybe years. She adjusted his blanket with practiced efficiency. You also have 3 cracked ribs, a concussion, and bruising that would make a mule kick look gentle. Doc Morrison says you're the stubbornest patient he's had in 30 years, staying alive out of pure spite. Jonas almost smiled at that. Spite had kept him alive through worse. The other men, Garrett and his crew. What happened to them? The nurse's face hardened. 4 dead. 1, the man who shot his own partner, is in the cell across from the sheriff's office, singing like a bird about Calvin Blackwood and his land schemes. Seems Mr. Blackwood has been running quite an operation, stealing property through fraud and murder. Your stand at Cottonwood Ridge broke the whole thing open. Before Jonas could respond, the door burst open and Sheriff Tom Brennan strode in, his weathered face creasing into a smile when he saw Jonas awake. Well, I'll be damned. The dead man walks, or at least opens his eyes. Brennan pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. He looked tired, Jonas noticed. Lines around his eyes that hadn't been there the last time they'd met, maybe 5 years back. How you feeling? Like I got shot. That's because you did. Twice, according to Doc Morrison. Once in the shoulder, and before that you took a bullet graze across your ribs that you apparently didn't even notice during the fight. Adrenaline's a hell of a thing. Jonas processed that. He didn't remember getting hit in the ribs. The whole battle was a blur of movement and gunfire, fear and determination. Tell me about Blackwood, Jonas said. Brennan's smile faded. Calvin Blackwood is sitting in my jail right now, screaming about lawyers and rights and how he's going to have my badge. But Pete, the man you shot by the barn, he's told us everything. Names, dates, properties. Blackwood's been running this scheme for 2 years. Finds small homesteaders with valuable land, fabricates loan documents, then sends Garrett and his crew to collect when the owners refuse to abandon their property. 15 families that we know of so far. The Hendersons were just the latest. Jonas felt sick. 15 families. How many dead? How many children orphaned? Why didn't anyone stop him sooner? Because he's rich and connected, and most of his victims were just simple farmers without the means to fight back legally. A few tried to take it to court, but Blackwood owns the judge in Prescott. The ones who fought back, Brennan's jaw tightened. Well, Garrett made sure they didn't fight long. And now? Now Pete's testimony changes everything. I've sent word to the territorial marshal. This is bigger than one county sheriff can handle. Blackwood's going to stand trial, and I intend to make sure he hangs. Brennan leaned forward. Thanks to you, Jonas. If you hadn't stood your ground, if you'd let Garrett take those children, we'd never have known. The Hendersons would have been just another family that moved on in the middle of the night. Jonas turned his head to look out the window. He could see a slice of Prescott's main street, false front buildings, a water trough, a few horses tied to hitching posts, normal life going on while he lay here broken and hurting. I didn't do it for justice, he said quietly. I did it because they were children who needed help. Does it matter why you did it? Result's the same. Those kids are alive because of you. Blackwood's reign of terror is over because of you. That's got to count for something. Jonas thought about that. Did intentions matter when weighed against results? He'd spent 3 years trying to atone for the violence of his past by removing himself from the world. But maybe atonement wasn't found in isolation. Maybe it was found in moments like this, standing between evil and innocence, even when it cost everything. The children, Jonas said. What's going to happen to them? Brennan's expression softened. That's complicated. They've got no other family that we can find. Their mother was an only child, father's people are back east somewhere, but we haven't been able to locate them. Normally they'd go to an orphanage in Helena, but... He paused. That girl, Annie, She told me in no uncertain terms that they're staying with you, said you promised them a home. Jonas's eyes widened. I never promised. She seems to think you did, and her brother backs her up. They've got it in their heads that you're their family now. Brennan studied Jonas's face. Would that be so terrible? You've got land, a cabin, well, the burned remains of a cabin. You clearly know how to take care of people. And those kids have already lost everything. Losing you too might break them. I'm not father material, Tom. I'm a broken-down ex-soldier who lives alone because he can't stand being around people. You were that. But the man who stood against 5 killers to protect 2 children he'd never met? That's a different man, Jonas. That's a man those kids could look up to. Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the reasons why this was impossible. But before he could speak, there was a commotion in the hallway. A child's voice raised in argument. I don't care if he's resting. We need to see him. Young lady, Dr. Morrison said no visitors until... Dr. Morrison can stuff it. Jonas is our family and we're seeing him right now. The door flew open and Annie burst in, Eli right behind her. The boy's left arm was in a sling, his face still pale but determined. Annie's dress was clean but rumpled, and her hair had been braided by someone who clearly didn't know much about braiding. When she saw Jonas awake, her face transformed. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she ran to his bedside. You're alive! You're really alive! They said you were, but I didn't believe them until I saw you myself. She grabbed his hand with both of hers, squeezing so hard it almost hurt. You can't ever do that again. Do you hear me? You can't ever almost die like that. Eli approached more slowly, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Mr. Hale. Sir, His voice broke. Thank you for everything, for standing, for fighting, for... He couldn't continue, just stood there with tears running down his face. Jonas looked at these 2 children, orphaned, wounded, traumatized by horrors no child should ever witness, and felt something crack open in his chest. Some wall he'd built around his heart over the past 3 years, some barrier between himself and the rest of humanity. These kids had broken through without even trying. I'm glad you're safe, he managed to say. Both of you. We're staying with Mrs. Patterson right now, Annie said, still gripping his hand. She's nice enough, but her house smells like cabbage, and she's got 17 cats. 17! And they're all mean except for the orange one. But it's just temporary until you're better and can take us home. Jonas glanced at Sheriff Brennan, who shrugged helplessly. Annie, Jonas said gently, my cabin burned down. There's no home to go back to. Then we'll build a new one. Eli's good with his hands, and I can fetch and carry things. We'll all work together. That's what families do. Honey, I'm not... You saved us, Eli said quietly. His voice was steady now, carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for his 13 years. You stood between us and death when you could have walked away. When any sane man would have walked away. You bled for us, nearly died for us. He met Jonas's eyes directly. That makes you family. That makes you the only family we've got left. So we're not going to an orphanage in Helena or anywhere else. We're staying with you, if you'll have us. Jonas looked at their faces, Annie's fierce determination, Eli's desperate hope, and thought about all the reasons he should say no. He was damaged goods, a man haunted by ghosts and nightmares. He knew nothing about raising children. He could barely take care of himself. The list of reasons went on, but then he remembered Annie's question from that terrible night. Will it hurt when you die? He remembered Eli's courage standing on the porch, offering himself up to save Jonas's life. He remembered how these children had fought to survive, how they'd refused to give up even when everything was taken from them. They deserved better than an orphanage. They deserved better than being separated and sent to strangers. They deserved a home. All right, Jonas heard himself say. We'll figure it out. Together. Annie's squeal of joy was so loud, the nurse came running to make sure no one was dying. She found instead 2 children embracing a wounded man, all 3 of them crying, and Sheriff Brennan grinning like he'd just witnessed something sacred. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of healing and planning. Jonas's shoulder mended slowly, the pain becoming a dull ache he could mostly ignore. Doc Morrison let him leave the clinic after 8 days, with strict orders to rest and not do anything stupid like getting shot again. Mrs. Patterson's house did indeed smell like cabbage and was overrun with cats, but she was kind to the children and didn't ask too many questions. Jonas stayed there too, sleeping on her sofa and trying not to feel useless while Eli and Annie attended to him with the fierce devotion of people who'd almost lost someone precious. The trial of Calvin Blackwood became the biggest news in Montana Territory. Newspapers from as far as Denver sent reporters to cover it. The story had everything: a corrupt banker, murdered families, a heroic last stand. Jonas hated the attention, but he gave his testimony when required, watching as Blackwood's polished veneer cracked under the weight of evidence. Pete, the gunman who'd shot his own partner to save the children, testified for the prosecution. His voice shook as he described the murders, the fraud, the systematic destruction of innocent families. He didn't ask for mercy and didn't expect it. When the judge sentenced him to 20 years hard labor, he accepted it with a nod. But before they took him away, he caught Jonas's eye in the courtroom. No words were spoken, but Jonas understood. The man had done terrible things, but in the end, he'd made one good choice. Maybe that wouldn't balance his scales, but at least he'd tried. Blackwood was sentenced to hang. The execution was scheduled for the first week of October. Through it all, Eli and Annie stayed close to Jonas. They helped him with simple tasks when his shoulder wouldn't cooperate. They brought him food and water. They told him stories about their parents, good memories, happy times before Garrett and his killers came. Jonas listened and began to understand who the Hendersons had been. Simple farmers who loved their children and worked their land and believed in a future that was stolen from them. One evening, sitting on Mrs. Patterson's porch, while Annie played with the orange cat and Eli whittled a piece of wood with his good hand, Jonas asked the question that had been bothering him. "Why did Blackwood want your land so badly? What made it worth killing for?" Eli's knife paused mid-stroke. "Pa never told us all the details, but I heard him talking with Ma one night about how Blackwood said there was silver in the hills behind our property. Said if the railroad came through, our land would be the staging ground for the whole mining operation, worth a fortune." "Was there? Silver?" "Don't know. Pa never looked. Said he didn't care if there was gold, silver, and diamonds under every rock. It was our home. You can't put a price on that." Jonas thought about that. John Henderson had died for that principle, that some things mattered more than money, more than progress, more than the cold calculations of men like Blackwood. He'd died protecting his home and his children. In the end, he'd succeeded at the second even while losing the first. "Your father was a good man," Jonas said. "The best," Eli agreed quietly. "He taught me everything I know about farming, about being honest, about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you." He looked at Jonas. "He would have liked you, I think. You stood when it mattered, just like he did." Annie abandoned the cat and climbed onto Jonas's lap, careful of his injured shoulder. She was getting more comfortable with him day by day, the terror slowly fading from her eyes. "Are we really going to build a new cabin?" she asked. "We are." "Can it have a loft? I always wanted a loft. Somewhere I could read and watch the stars through a window." "I think we can manage that." "And can we get a dog?" "Eli wants a dog. Don't you, Eli?" Her brother smiled. "I wouldn't object to a dog." Jonas found himself smiling too. These conversations about lofts and dogs and the mundane details of ordinary life felt strange after years of isolation, but they also felt right, like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was trying to solve. "We'll see about the dog," he said, which made Annie laugh because that's what parents always said when they meant yes but didn't want to admit it yet. The thought stopped Jonas cold. Parents. Was that what he was becoming? The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. 3 weeks after the fight at Cottonwood Ridge, Jonas, Eli, and Annie rode back to the burned cabin. Sheriff Brennan came with them, along with Doc Morrison and half a dozen men from town who'd heard about Jonas's stand and wanted to help rebuild. The sight of the destroyed cabin hit Jonas harder than he'd expected. 3 years of his life had been lived in that simple structure. 3 years of trying to outrun his past, of seeking peace and solitude. All of it reduced to charred timbers and ash, but as he stood there looking at the ruins, he realized something. That cabin had been a place of isolation, a refuge built on the principle that the world was best kept at arm's length. That wasn't what these children needed. That wasn't what he needed anymore either. "We'll build it bigger," he said, "strong enough for a family." The men from town nodded approval and set to work. They cleared the burned timbers, sorted what could be salvaged, and began laying out the foundation for a new structure. Eli worked alongside them despite his wounded shoulder, and Annie appointed herself the official water carrier and encourager, moving from man to man with a ladle and kind words. Jonas watched them work and felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It took him a while to identify the feeling, and when he did, it nearly brought him to his knees. Hope. After 3 years of darkness and guilt and grief, he felt hope. "They're good kids," Sheriff Brennan said, coming to stand beside Jonas. "You're doing right by them." "I'm trying. Doesn't mean I know what I'm doing." "None of us do. That's the secret of parenting. Everyone's making it up as they go along. The trick is to love them and keep them safe and teach them right from wrong. You've already proven you can do all three." Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to list all his inadequacies and failures, but the evidence was literally working right in front of him. 2 children who'd been broken by tragedy, but were slowly putting themselves back together, who laughed and worked and planned for a future they couldn't have imagined 3 weeks ago. "What about Blackwood's claim on their land?" Jonas asked. "The fraudulent loan papers?" "Null and void. The territorial judge threw out every one of Blackwood's fake documents. The Henderson property belongs to Eli and Annie free and clear, which means it belongs to you now, as their guardian." Brennan pulled out an envelope from his coat. "Speaking of which, you need to sign these papers making the guardianship official. Can't have you raising those kids without proper legal standing." Jonas took the envelope with hands that shook slightly. Legal guardianship. It made everything real in a way that even the past 3 weeks hadn't. These children would be his responsibility, his family, his reason for getting up every morning. He opened the envelope and read through the papers. They were straightforward. Jonas Hale accepting full legal responsibility for Eli Henderson, age 13, and Annie Henderson, age 8. All their care, education, and welfare now fell to him. He thought about signing, about the weight of that decision. Then he looked at Eli carrying timber with men twice his age, trying so hard to be strong. Looked at Annie laughing as she splashed water on one of the workers who'd teased her about her braids. Jonas signed the papers. The new cabin took shape over the next month. It was larger than the old one, a main room with a real kitchen area, 2 bedrooms, and yes, a loft with a window that looked out over the valley. The men from town came every weekend to help, and slowly the structure rose from the ashes of the old. Eli proved to be handy with tools, learning quickly and working with the determined focus of someone who needed purpose to survive his grief. Annie helped where she could and spent her free time exploring the property, cataloging every tree and rock and animal burrow with the serious attention of a naturalist. Jonas worked despite Doc Morrison's protests, his shoulder protesting every hammer swing and board lifted. But the pain felt right somehow, like penance and purpose combined. He was building something that mattered, building a home for children who needed one, building a future from the ashes of his past. One evening, when the framework was up and the roof was half finished, Jonas and Eli sat on what would eventually be the front porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of fire. "Can I ask you something?" Eli said after a long silence. "Always. Do you ever think about the men you killed, the ones who came after us?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment. He'd thought about little else in his private moments, when the children were asleep and the darkness pressed close. He thought about Cal Garrett's last words, about Tommy, the frightened kid who'd panicked, about all the violence that had stained that terrible night. "Yes," he said finally, "every day." "Does it bother you, killing them?" "It bothers me that I had to. It bothers me that men like Blackwood create situations where good people have to become killers to survive. But do I regret pulling the trigger?" Jonas shook his head. "No. Not when the alternative was letting them hurt you and Annie. Some lines can't be crossed. Some evils can't be tolerated." Eli nodded slowly. "I think about them too. About Garrett shooting Ma and Pa. About how he smiled when he did it, like it didn't matter. Like they were nothing." His voice hardened. "I'm glad he's dead. Does that make me a bad person? Jonas put his hand on the boy's good shoulder. It makes you human. Your parents were murdered in front of you. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be glad their killer is gone. But don't let that anger poison you, Eli. Don't let it turn you into something you're not. What if I want revenge? What if I want to make Blackwood suffer the way he made us suffer? Then you'd be giving him power over you. He'd own your future the same way he tried to own your land. The best revenge is living well, being happy, honoring your parents by becoming the man they wanted you to be. Jonas paused. Your father stood against evil and paid the ultimate price. You've got his courage. Make sure you also have his principles. Eli wiped his eyes roughly. I miss them so much. Ma and Pa. Some mornings I wake up and forget for just a second that they're gone. Then I remember and it's like losing them all over again. I know. I lost people too, in the war, people I cared about. And I'm not going to lie to you, it doesn't stop hurting, but it gets easier to carry. The weight doesn't go away, but you get stronger, strong enough to bear it and still live your life. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dropped below the ridgeline. Annie emerged from the cabin's skeleton, her dress dirty and her hair a mess, carrying something cupped in her hands. Look! She opened her hands to reveal a small bird with a broken wing. I found him by the creek. Can we keep him? Just until his wing heals? Jonas looked at the tiny creature, then at Annie's hopeful face, then at Eli's slight smile. We'll need a box and some cloth for bedding, he said, and you'll have to feed him every few hours. It's a big responsibility. I can do it, I promise. As Annie ran off to find supplies for her patient, Eli chuckled. You know she's going to want to keep every injured animal she finds, right? We're going to end up with a house full of broken-winged birds and three-legged rabbits. Probably, Jonas agreed. But if that's the price of her smile, I'll pay it gladly. The cabin was finished in early October, just as the first cold winds began sweeping down from the mountains. They moved in with the few possessions they'd accumulated, beds and chairs donated by townspeople, clothes sewn by Mrs. Patterson, and Annie's growing collection of rescued animals, which now included the bird, a baby raccoon with an injured paw, and a box of crickets she was convinced were lonely. The first night in the new cabin, Jonas lay awake listening to the children sleep in the next room. Eli's breathing was deep and even, finally free of the nightmares that had plagued him for weeks. Annie talked in her sleep sometimes, but tonight she was quiet. Jonas thought about how his life had changed in just 6 weeks. He'd gone from a man running from his past to a man responsible for 2 children's futures, from isolation to family, from trying to forget how to fight to remembering why fighting sometimes mattered. The ghosts of his past were still there, Jenny Dawson and her children, the men he'd killed in the war, the faces that haunted his dreams. But they seemed quieter now, less accusatory. Maybe saving Eli and Annie didn't balance the scales for everyone he'd failed to save, but it was something. It was a start. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance. Jonas recognized it as the same wolf he'd heard that first terrible night when Eli had stumbled onto his porch covered in blood. Back then, the sound had seemed like a harbinger of death. Now it just sounded lonely, calling out to the darkness for others of its kind. Jonas understood that feeling. He'd been calling out to the darkness for 3 years, not knowing what he was searching for. Now he knew. He'd been searching for purpose, for redemption, for a reason to stop running and start living. He'd found it in 2 orphaned children who needed someone to stand between them and a cruel world. The wolf howled again, and somewhere in the night another wolf answered, not so alone after all. Jonas closed his eyes and for the first time in 3 years slept deeply and dreamlessly until dawn. Winter came to Cottonwood Ridge with a fury that reminded Jonas why Montana Territory wasn't for the faint of heart. The first real snow fell in mid-November, transforming the valley into a white wilderness that stretched as far as the eye could see. Jonas woke that morning to find Annie pressed against the loft window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared in wonder at the transformed landscape. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "like the whole world got covered in sugar." Jonas smiled and started the fire, his shoulders still stiff in the cold mornings despite months of healing. Eli emerged from the bedroom rubbing sleep from his eyes, then stopped short when he saw the snow. Pa always said the first snow was special, he said quietly. Said it was God's way of giving the earth a fresh start, everything buried and clean and new. The mention of their father brought a moment of silence. The children spoke of their parents more freely now, the raw grief transforming slowly into bittersweet memory. Jonas had learned to simply listen, to let them share their stories without trying to fix the unfixable hurt. Your pa was a wise man, Jonas said. Now get dressed. That fresh start means we've got a lot of work ahead of us. Cattle need feeding, water troughs need checking, and I imagine Annie's menagerie will need extra attention. The menagerie had grown considerably. In addition to the bird, whose wing had healed but who refused to leave, and the raccoon, they now had a half-blind barn owl, a young deer with a twisted leg that Annie had named Hope, and a mangy dog that had wandered up one day and decided to stay. Eli had wanted to name the dog something dignified like Duke or Major, but Annie had taken one look at its scraggly appearance and christened it Patches. The name stuck. They worked through the morning, establishing the rhythms that would carry them through the winter. Jonas handled the heavy labor while Eli managed what he could with his still healing shoulder. Annie took charge of the animals with the fierce devotion of someone who'd been given purpose and refused to fail at it. By noon, they gathered in the warm cabin for lunch, venison stew that Jonas had learned to make from memory of his mother's recipe. Served with bread, Annie had somehow convinced Mrs. Patterson to teach her to bake. The girl had taken to domestic skills with surprising enthusiasm, as if creating order in the kitchen helped counterbalance the chaos that had destroyed her previous life. Jonas? Annie asked around a mouthful of bread. Can we get a tree for Christmas? A real one we cut ourselves? Jonas looked at Eli, who shrugged. Ma always made a big thing of Christmas. Tree with candles, presents wrapped in brown paper, singing hymns on Christmas Eve. His voice caught. It was her favorite time of year. Jonas understood the unspoken question. Would they honor that tradition or let it die with the woman who'd created it? The easy answer was to skip Christmas entirely, avoid the painful reminder of all they'd lost. But easy answers rarely served anyone well. We'll get a tree, Jonas said firmly, and we'll do Christmas proper. Your mother would want that. Annie's face lit up like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Even Eli smiled, though his eyes remained sad. The weeks leading up to Christmas became a flurry of preparation that Jonas hadn't experienced since childhood. Annie threw herself into the task with characteristic intensity, fashioning decorations from pine cones and ribbon that Mrs. Patterson donated. Eli worked with Jonas to build presents in secret. A new saddle stand for Jonas, a chest for Annie to store her growing collection of books that people from town kept giving her. Jonas found himself carving a small wooden horse for Annie and a knife with an engraved handle for Eli. The work was painstaking with his damaged shoulder, but he persisted through the pain. These children had lost so much. The least he could do was give them a Christmas worth remembering. One evening in mid-December, Sheriff Brennan rode up just as they were finishing supper. His face was grim in a way that made Jonas's hand instinctively move toward the rifle by the door. Easy, Jonas, Brennan said, dismounting heavily. No trouble coming your way, but there's news from Prescott you need to hear. They gathered around the table while Brennan accepted coffee and warmed his hands on the cup. Annie sat close to Jonas, picking up on the sheriff's tension. Eli's face had gone carefully neutral, preparing for whatever blow was about to fall. Calvin Blackwood is dead, Brennan said without preamble. Jonas felt something cold settle in his stomach. The hanging? No. He hung himself in his cell 3 nights ago, used his belt. The guard found him at dawn. Brennan's jaw tightened. Left a note. Confessed to everything. The fraud, the murders, all of it. Said he couldn't face the rope, couldn't give the town the satisfaction of watching him dance at the end of a noose. Wanted to control his own end. Eli stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. Good. He's dead, and I'm glad. I hope he's burning in hell right now for what he did. Eli, Jonas started, but the boy was already moving toward the door. Don't. Just don't. Eli's voice shook with barely controlled emotion. You're going to tell me not to hate him, that it's not Christian to celebrate a man's death. But he killed my parents, Jonas. He murdered them for money and land. So yes, I'm glad he's dead. and I won't apologize for that. The door slammed behind him. Through the window, Jonas watched the boy stride toward the barn, his shoulders rigid with anger and grief. Annie's small hand found Jonas's. Is Eli going to be okay? Eventually, Jonas said, hoping it was true. He looked at Brennan. Anything else in the note? Names of his associates. Turns out Blackwood was part of a larger operation, land speculators working all over Montana Territory. The territorial marshal is making arrests as we speak. Brennan paused. There was also a section about the Henderson property. Seems the silver rumors were true. Blackwood had an assayer's report showing high-grade ore in the hills. That land is worth a fortune. Jonas absorbed this in silence. The very thing that had gotten John and Sarah Henderson killed would now provide for their children. There was a cruel irony in that. What happens now? Jonas asked. The property belongs to Eli and Annie. When they come of age, they can decide whether to mine it, sell the mineral rights, or leave it untouched. Until then, as their legal guardian, you'll manage it. Brennan pulled out another envelope. Speaking of which, the territorial government is offering compensation to all of Blackwood's victims' families. It's not much, but it's something. $3,000 for the Hendersons. $3,000. In Montana Territory in 1875, that was enough to live comfortably for years. Enough to ensure the children's future, to hire help for the ranch, to build something lasting. Put it in a trust, Jonas said. For the children. They'll need it more than I do. Jonas, you're raising 2 kids on a working ranch. You could use... Put it in a trust, Tom. That's blood money in a way, paid for with their parents' lives. It should be theirs and only theirs. Brennan nodded slowly. You're a better man than most, Jonas Hale. After the sheriff left, Jonas found Eli in the barn, sitting in an empty stall with Patches pressed against his side. The boy's face was wet with tears he'd been holding back all evening. Jonas sat down beside him without speaking, just offering presents. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the horses shift in their stalls and the wind whistle through the eaves. I wanted to see him hang, Eli said finally. Wanted to watch him die knowing that everyone knew what he'd done. That coward took that away from me. Even in death, he found a way to escape justice. Is that what you need? To see your enemy destroyed in front of a crowd? I don't know what I need. Eli's voice broke. I just know that nothing feels right. He's dead, but they're still dead. Nothing brings them back. Nothing makes it better. Jonas thought carefully about his next words. You're right. Nothing makes it better. Nothing brings your parents back or erases what happened. But here's the thing, Eli. You get to choose what happens next. You can let this hatred poison you, turn you bitter and hard. Or you can honor your parents by living the kind of life they wanted for you, by being the kind of man your father was. What if I don't know how to do that? Then you learn. We learn together. Jonas put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Your father stood against Blackwood knowing it might cost him everything. He did it anyway because some things matter more than safety or comfort or even life itself. That courage is in you, Eli. I've seen it. Now you need to decide what to do with it. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned against Jonas, and Jonas put his arm around the boy's shoulders, and they sat there in the barn while Eli cried out some of the poison that had been building in his heart. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the sun turning the snow-covered valley into a field of diamonds. Jonas woke to find Annie already up, standing by the tree they'd cut last week and decorated with her handmade ornaments. Her rag doll, the same one she'd been clutching the night Jonas found her by the creek, sat propped beneath the tree like another guest at their celebration. Merry Christmas, Annie said softly when she noticed Jonas watching. Merry Christmas, little one. Eli emerged from the bedroom, his eyes still shadowed but his expression lighter than it had been since Brennan's visit. The 3 of them gathered around the small tree, and Jonas found himself leading them in a prayer his mother had taught him decades ago, thanking God for shelter and safety, for food and family, for the gift of another day. When he finished, Annie hugged him so tight he thought his ribs might crack. They opened their presents slowly, savoring each one. Annie's delighted squeal over the wooden horse made all of Jonas's painstaking carving worthwhile. Eli ran his thumb over his new knife's engraved handle, to Eli, a man of courage, and had to turn away to hide his tears. Jonas's gifts were simpler but no less meaningful. A new shirt Annie had sewn herself, the stitches slightly crooked but serviceable. A leather bookmark from Eli, tooled with an intricate pattern that must have taken weeks to complete. And from both of them together, a framed charcoal sketch of the three of them standing in front of their cabin, drawn by someone in town from Annie's description. Jonas stared at the sketch for a long time. The artist had captured something true. A man and two children who'd found each other in the darkest circumstances and chosen to become family. His throat tightened with emotion he didn't know how to express. "It's perfect," he managed finally. "Thank you." They spent Christmas Day in simple celebration. Jonas made his mother's recipe for ham and sweet potatoes. Annie read aloud from a book of poetry Mrs. Patterson had given her. Eli taught them both a card game his father had shown him. And as evening fell, they sat by the fire, and Jonas found himself telling stories of his own childhood, carefully edited versions that left out the worst of the war, but captured the spirit of a young man finding his way in a complicated world. "Tell us about the bravest thing you ever did," Annie requested, her head on Jonas's shoulder, sleep pulling at her voice. Jonas thought about that. He could tell them about cavalry charges and desperate battles, about moments when death seemed certain and survival impossible, but that wasn't what she was really asking. "The bravest thing I ever did," he said slowly, "was opening my door the night your brother knocked on it. I'd spent 3 years hiding from the world, trying to forget I was the kind of man who could fight, could kill. And then Eli appeared, bleeding and desperate, asking me to hide his sister. I could have turned him away, could have sent you both on and kept my distance. That would have been easier, safer. But you didn't," Eli said. "No, I stood up. And in doing that, I became someone I'd forgotten I could be. Someone who mattered. Someone with purpose." Jonas looked at both children. "You two gave me that. You saved me just as much as I saved you." Annie was asleep now, her breathing deep and even. Eli helped Jonas carry her to bed, tucking her in with the gentle care of someone who'd learned too young how precious and fragile life could be. Later, after Eli had gone to bed and the cabin was quiet, Jonas stood on the porch looking out at the moonlit valley. The snow had stopped, leaving the world clean and still. Smoke rose from his chimney, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke into the cold air. 6 months ago, he'd been alone in a burned cabin with nothing but ghosts for company. Now he had children sleeping peacefully under a roof he'd built with his own hands. He had responsibility and purpose, and a reason to face each new day. The cost had been high, blood and pain and violence he'd sworn to leave behind. But standing here in the Montana night, listening to the wind sing through the cottonwoods and the distant howl of wolves calling to each other across the empty miles, Jonas knew he'd make the same choice again. Some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth dying for. And some things, like 2 orphan children who needed someone to stand between them and a cruel world, were worth living for. January brought new challenges. A brutal cold snap froze the water troughs solid and kept them inside for days at a time. Jonas used the forced confinement to teach Eli and Annie the skills they'd need to survive in Montana territory. Reading and arithmetic from the books Sheriff Brennan brought. Practical skills like mending harness and curing leather. And on clear days when the cold relented enough for them to venture outside, tracking and hunting and reading the signs of weather in the clouds. Eli proved to be a natural hunter, patient and observant in ways that reminded Jonas of the best scouts he'd served with. Annie had less interest in hunting but developed an uncanny ability to predict weather changes, claiming she could smell snow coming hours before the first flakes fell. February brought a crisis that tested everything Jonas had taught them. A late winter storm trapped them in the cabin for 3 days, the wind howling with such fury that venturing outside meant risking death. On the second day, they heard a sound that made Jonas's blood run cold. Wolves, close to the house, drawn by the smell of their livestock. "Stay inside," Jonas ordered, grabbing his rifle. "No matter what you hear, you stay inside." "Let me help," Eli said. "I can shoot. You know I can." Jonas wanted to refuse, wanted to protect the boy from more violence. But Eli was right. He could shoot, and they were going to need every gun they had if the wolf pack decided to test their defenses. "All right, but you do exactly what I say. Understand?" They stepped into the storm together, father and son in all but blood, to face the wolves circling their home. The pack was larger than Jonas had expected, maybe 15 animals, their eyes gleaming in the darkness like malevolent stars. They'd already killed 2 of the sheep, the snow around the pen stained red with blood. Jonas fired a shot over their heads, the sound cracking through the storm. The wolves scattered, but didn't flee, regrouping just beyond rifle range. They were desperate, hungry enough to challenge humans despite the danger. "We need to get the livestock into the barn," Jonas said. "Can you cover me?" Eli nodded, his face pale but determined. "I've got you." What followed was a desperate dance between man and beast. Jonas moved among the panicked animals, driving them toward the barn while Eli kept watch, firing warning shots whenever a wolf got too bold. The storm screamed around them, the cold biting through their clothes, their hands going numb on their weapons. One wolf, bolder or more desperate than the rest, rushed Jonas as he was securing the barn door. Jonas saw it coming, swung his rifle around, but his wounded shoulder chose that moment to seize up. The wolf launched itself at his throat. The crack of Eli's rifle split the air. The wolf tumbled sideways, dead before it hit the ground. Jonas stood frozen, his heart hammering, staring at the boy who'd just saved his life. "Are you okay?" Eli's voice shook, the rifle still aimed at where the wolf had been. Yeah, I'm okay." Jonas found his voice. "Good shot, son." Son. The word had slipped out naturally, without thought. Eli's eyes widened slightly, then filled with tears that the cold wind froze on his cheeks. "We should get inside," the boy said roughly, "before more come." They made it back to the cabin, where Annie was waiting by the window, her face pressed to the glass. She threw herself at both of them the moment they entered, sobbing with relief. "I heard the shooting, and I thought... "We're fine," Jonas assured her, pulling her close with his good arm. "Eli kept me safe. Saved my life, actually." Annie turned to her brother with awe. "You killed a wolf?" "Had to," Eli said quietly. "It was going for Jonas." That night, huddled around the fire while the storm raged outside, Jonas looked at his family and felt a profound gratitude that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with love. These children had come into his life broken and afraid, and somehow in the healing of them, he'd been healed too. "Tell us a story," Annie requested, her usual request before sleep. "A true one. About Ma and Pa." Eli was quiet for a moment, then began to speak. Pa used to say that the hardest thing in life wasn't surviving hard times. It was staying good through them. He said the world tries to make you hard and bitter, especially out here in Montana territory where everything's a fight. But the real test of a person is whether they can face that hardness and stay kind anyway. "He sounds like he was a wise man," Jonas said. "He was. And Ma, she used to sing while she worked. Even when things were tough, crops failing or money tight, she'd sing. Said music was how you reminded yourself that beauty still existed even when everything felt ugly." Eli's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I can't remember the tune anymore. It's only been 6 months and I can't remember how her voice sounded." Jonas understood that fear, the terror of forgetting the people you'd loved. "Tell me about the song. What were the words?" Slowly, haltingly, Eli recited the lyrics to a hymn about grace and redemption. As he spoke, Jonas recognized it. A song his own mother had sung in their little church in Pennsylvania a lifetime ago. He began to hum the melody, finding the tune from memory. Eli's face transformed. "That's it. That's the song." Annie sat up excitedly. "Sing it, both of you." So Jonas sang, his voice rough and unpracticed, while Eli joined in on the chorus. Annie listened with shining eyes, and when they finished, she applauded like they'd just performed in a grand concert hall. "Teach me," she demanded. "I want to learn Ma's song." They spent the rest of the evening singing that hymn over and over until all 3 of them knew every word, every note. And in the singing, something shifted. The past wasn't forgotten. It couldn't be, shouldn't be, but it became part of their present in a way that felt less like loss and more like connection. March brought the first hints of spring, and with it, a visitor that Jonas hadn't expected. He was working with Eli to repair winter damage to the corral when a familiar figure rode up the path. Pete, the gunman who'd shot his own partner to save the children. Jonas's hand went instinctively to his rifle, but Pete held up his hands in a gesture of peace. He looked different than Jonas remembered, thinner, older, with new lines carved deep into his face. "Easy now," Pete said. "I come in peace. Just got released early for good behavior and testimony against Blackwood's associates. I wanted to stop by before I left Montana Territory for good." "Why?" Jonas asked, not lowering the rifle. "To apologize. To these children especially." Pete dismounted slowly, wincing with pain from old wounds. "I was part of what happened to your parents. I won't make excuses. I knew what we were doing was wrong, and I did it anyway. The money seemed important at the time, more important than morality or decency or the lives of good people." Eli stepped forward, his face hard. "You're the one who burned our house." "I am. I lit the torches and I watched it burn, and I felt nothing but satisfaction at doing my job." Pete's voice broke. "And then I saw your faces, saw two terrified children running for their lives, and something in me just cracked. I have daughters your age, and I thought, what if someone did this to them? What if someone murdered me and their mother and left them alone in the world?" "But you still did it," Eli said flatly. "Feeling bad after doesn't change what happened." "No, it doesn't. Nothing I say or do will ever change that night, but I can tell you that every day in that prison I thought about you two, wondered if you'd survived, if you'd found safety, if you'd ever be able to move past what we did to you." Pete looked at Jonas. "And then I heard about Jonas Hale, the man who stood against 5 killers to protect 2 children, the man who fought Garrett himself and lived to tell the tale. And I knew you'd survived, knew you'd found someone who cared enough to stand." Jonas lowered the rifle slowly. "What do you want, Pete?" "Nothing. I don't deserve anything. I just wanted you to know that what you did mattered. You changed something in me that night when you could have killed me and didn't, when you let me make one good choice before the law took me away. I've spent every day since trying to figure out how to be the kind of man who makes choices like that all the time, not just once when it's life or death." Annie, who'd been watching from the porch, came down the steps slowly. She studied Pete with the serious expression she got when thinking deep thoughts. "Do you still have daughters?" she asked. "I do. 2 girls, 9 and 11. My sister's been caring for them while I was locked up." "Are you going back to them?" "If they'll have me. I wrote letters but never sent them. Didn't know what to say. How do you tell your children you became a monster?" Annie thought about this. "Maybe you tell them you were lost, but now you're found. That you made terrible mistakes, but you're going to spend the rest of your life being better. Ma used to say everyone deserves a chance to change if they really want to." Pete's eyes filled with tears. "Your mother was a wise woman." "She was." Annie paused. "I don't forgive you. I'm not ready for that. Maybe I never will be. But I hope you go home to your daughters and never leave them again." Pete nodded, unable to speak. He mounted his horse and turned to go, then looked back one last time. "For what it's worth," he said, "your parents died brave. They fought for you until the very end. That's worth remembering." Then he rode away, heading east toward whatever redemption he could find in a world that rarely offered second chances. Eli watched him go, his expression unreadable. "Do you think people can really change? Or are we all just what we've always been?" Jonas considered the question carefully. "I think we're all capable of terrible things and beautiful things, sometimes in the same day. The question isn't whether we can change, it's whether we choose to. Pete made a choice that night when he shot his partner instead of you. Maybe he'll make that same choice every day for the rest of his life, or maybe he'll slip back into being the man he was. But today, right now, he chose to come here and apologize. That's something." "It's not enough," Eli said. "No," Jonas agreed. "It's not enough. But it's a start." They returned to work on the corral, and life continued in the steady rhythm of ranch work and family. The incident with Pete became another thread in the tapestry of their shared story, not forgotten, but woven into the larger pattern of healing and growth. As spring deepened into summer, Jonas watched Eli and Annie transform before his eyes. The boy grew taller, filling out with the muscle of hard work and good food. His confidence increased as Jonas taught him to manage the ranch operations, trusting him with responsibilities that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. The nightmares came less frequently now, and when they did, Eli had learned to talk about them instead of holding the fear inside until it poisoned him. Annie bloomed like the wildflowers that covered the valley in June. Her collection of rescued animals became a full-fledged menagerie that included 3 cats, 2 more dogs, a goat with a bad eye, and a whole family of rabbits that she absolutely insisted were not dinner material. She learned to read with a voraciousness that exhausted their small library, forcing Sheriff Brennan to bring new books every visit. And she developed a gift for storytelling, spinning tales for Jonas and Eli in the evenings that ranged from silly adventures to profound parables about loss and healing. One warm July evening, after a long day of haying, they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance across the valley. Annie was half asleep against Jonas's side, and Eli whittled a piece of wood with the knife Jonas had given him for Christmas. "Jonas," Eli said without looking up from his work, "can I ask you something?" "Always." "When did you stop being Jonas Hale, the man who saved us, and become just Jonas? Our Jonas?" The question caught Jonas off guard. He thought about it, trying to pinpoint the moment when these children had stopped being his responsibility and become his family. Was it the night he'd signed the guardianship papers? The first time Annie had called him to look at a rescued animal? The morning Eli had saved his life from the wolf? Or was it something more gradual, a slow accumulation of shared meals and stories, of laughter and tears, of ordinary moments that had somehow added up to love? "I don't know," Jonas admitted. "Maybe there wasn't one moment. Maybe it just happened day by day, until one morning I woke up and realized you weren't guests in my house. You were my family, you were home." Eli set down his knife and looked at Jonas directly. "We feel the same way. About you. You're not just the man who saved us anymore. He struggled for words. "You're what Pa would have wanted for us. Someone strong and good. Someone who teaches us how to live right, even when everything's hard." Annie stirred against Jonas's side. "You're our father now," she said sleepily. "Can we call you that? Or is it too soon?" Jonas felt his throat tighten with emotion. 6 months ago, he'd been a broken man hiding from his past. Now 2 children were asking if they could call him father. The word carried weight, responsibility and love, fear and hope all tangled together. "It's not too soon," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "I'd be honored." Annie sat up and threw her arms around his neck. "I love you, Papa." Papa. Not father or dad, but the intimate, trusting word a child uses for the parent they feel safe with. Jonas held her close, then reached out and pulled Eli into the embrace. The 3 of them sat there on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, while the fireflies danced and the Montana evening settled soft and warm around them. "I love you both," Jonas said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "More than I knew I could love anything." And in that moment, with his children in his arms and stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Jonas Hale understood something profound. Redemption wasn't found in grand gestures or single moments of heroism. It was found in the daily choice to show up, to care, to love, even when love meant risking your heart all over again. The fire at Cottonwood Ridge had taken everything from these children, but from those ashes, they'd built something new. Something that couldn't be destroyed by men like Blackwood or stolen by men like Garrett. They'd built a family, forged in violence but sustained by love, and that was worth every flame, every drop of blood, every nightmare that still occasionally woke Jonas in the darkest hours. He'd stood between evil and innocence, and somehow, miraculously, they'd all survived. More than survived. They'd healed each other, saved each other, become each other's reason for facing tomorrow. The past would always be there, a shadow they couldn't escape. But shadows only existed because there was light to cast them. And looking at his children, his son and daughter, Jonas saw nothing but light and possibility and hope for a future none of them could have imagined 6 months ago. Summer faded into fall, and life continued in its beautiful, ordinary way. They harvested hay and prepared for another winter. They celebrated Eli's 14th birthday with a cake Annie baked that was slightly lopsided but tasted like heaven. They mourned quietly on the anniversary of John and Sarah Henderson's deaths, honoring their memory with stories and tears and the certain knowledge that they were missed. And through it all, Jonas Hale learned what it meant to be a father, not through blood, but through choice. through standing up when it mattered, through showing two broken children that love could survive even the darkest night, through proving that sometimes the family you choose matters more than the family you were born to. The wolves still howled in the Montana darkness. The wind still whispered through the cottonwoods. And three people who'd found each other in tragedy continued building a life worth living, day by precious day. 3 years passed like water flowing over stones. Steady, persistent, changing everything it touched while seeming to move at its own unhurried pace. The cabin at Cottonwood Ridge grew along with the family inside it. Jonas added another room when Eli turned 16 and needed his own space. Annie's loft became a sanctuary filled with books and rescued animals and drawings she'd started making of the Montana landscape. The property itself transformed from a simple homestead into a thriving ranch, with cattle grazing the lower pastures and horses that Eli trained with a patience and skill that would have made his father proud. But it was the spring of 1878 that brought the reckoning Jonas had been both expecting and dreading. He was mending fence with Eli when Sheriff Brennan rode up, accompanied by two men Jonas didn't recognize. One was elderly with silver hair and expensive clothes that marked him as someone from back east. The other was younger, maybe 30, with a lawyer's careful eyes and a leather satchel clutched against his chest. "Jonas," Brennan called out, his tone apologetic. "Got some folks here need to speak with you and the children. Official business." Jonas felt his gut tighten. Official business was rarely good news. He and Eli walked back to the house where Annie was hanging laundry, her movements graceful and efficient. At 15, she'd grown into a young woman who bore striking resemblance to the mother she'd lost, though Jonas only knew this from the photograph that sat on the mantel, the one item salvaged from the Henderson home. They gathered in the main room, the tension thick enough to cut. The older man introduced himself as Harold Pemberton, attorney from Philadelphia. The younger was his associate, Marcus Webb. "Mr. Hale," Pemberton began, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. "We represent the estate of Samuel Henderson, late of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was the father of one John Henderson, who I believe was married to Sarah Matthews and had two children, Eli and Annie." Jonas felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Eli and Annie, saw their confusion mixed with sudden hope and fear. "John Henderson's father is dead?" Jonas asked carefully. "Passed 6 months ago. It's taken us this long to locate his grandchildren. Mr. Samuel Henderson was a wealthy man, owned a shipping company, several properties, considerable investments. His estate is valued at approximately $200,000. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. $200,000 was more money than most people in Montana Territory would see in 10 lifetimes. "And?" Jonas's voice came out harder than he intended. "And the estate passes to his surviving heirs, in this case his grandchildren, Eli and Annie Henderson. We've come to collect them and escort them back to Philadelphia, where they'll be enrolled in proper schools and introduced to society befitting their new station." Annie moved closer to Jonas, her hand finding his. Eli's face had gone carefully blank, the expression he wore when processing something too big to show emotion about. "Collect them," Jonas repeated slowly. "Like luggage." Pemberton had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I understand they've been in your care since the unfortunate incident with their parents. The estate is prepared to compensate you for your time and expenses. Shall we say $500? Jonas felt rage building in his chest, hot and familiar. $500. For 3 years of raising 2 orphaned children, for teaching them to read and ride and survive in this territory, for holding them when they screamed from nightmares about watching their parents murdered, for being their father when they had no one else. "Now, see here," Webb started, but Pemberton held up a hand. "Mr. Hale, I understand this is emotional, but surely you can see that these children deserve the opportunities their grandfather's wealth can provide. The finest education, social connections, a future far beyond what Montana Territory can offer." "And what about what they want?" Jonas turned to Sheriff Brennan. "Is this legal? Can they just take my children?" Brennan looked miserable. "Jonas, you're their legal guardian, but this is their blood family's estate. The law is complicated here. If the children were younger, you'd have more standing, but Eli's 16 now, nearly a man, and Annie's old enough to have some say. It comes down to what they want. All eyes turned to Eli and Annie. The silence stretched like piano wire pulled too tight. "How did you find us?" Eli asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil Jonas could see in his eyes. "The territorial government keeps records of all Blackwood's victims and their families," Webb explained. "When we traced John Henderson's lineage, we found the reports from Sheriff Brennan about the incident at Cottonwood Ridge and the subsequent guardianship arrangement." "Did you know about us?" Annie's voice was small but sharp. "Did our grandfather know we existed?" Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. "Samuel Henderson and his son were estranged. John left Philadelphia 20 years ago after a disagreement about his father's business practices. They never reconciled. However, Samuel's will specifically states that any living descendants of his son are to inherit his estate. So he knew Pa might have children," Eli said, "but he never tried to find us, never sent a letter or money or even acknowledgement that we existed. And now that he's dead and his conscience is haunting him, he wants to make up for it by buying us with his fortune." "That's hardly fair," Webb started. "Fair?" Eli's voice rose. "You want to talk about fair? My parents were murdered for their land. We ran for our lives through the darkness. Jonas Hale, this man right here, stood against 5 killers when he didn't have to, got shot protecting us, gave us a home when we had nothing. And you show up 3 years later with blood money from a grandfather who couldn't be bothered to know us while he was alive, and you think $500 makes everything square?" Jonas put a hand on Eli's shoulder. "Easy, son." The word son hung in the air. Pemberton noticed it, his expression calculating. "Mr. Hale," the attorney said carefully, "I can see you care for these children. That's admirable, but caring for them doesn't change their legal right to their inheritance. And more importantly, it doesn't change the reality that you're one man running a ranch in Montana Territory. What happens if you get injured? If you die? These children would be alone again. In Philadelphia, they'd have security, education, opportunities. They have those things here," Jonas interrupted. "Maybe not fancy schools or society parties, but they have a home. They have family. They have a life they've built with their own hands. A life limited by geography and circumstance," Pemberton pressed. "Mr. Hale, I've seen your ranch. It's respectable for Montana Territory, but it's not what?" Jonas's voice was dangerous now. "Not good enough for rich man's grandchildren? Not refined enough? Not civilized enough?" "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant." Jonas stood, his full height and presence filling the room. "You come here with your Eastern suits and your $200,000, and you think that makes you better than us. That makes you qualified to decide what's best for my children." "They're not legally your children," Webb pointed out. "You're their guardian, which is different from—" "They're my children in every way that matters," Jonas said flatly. "I've earned that right with 3 years of my life, with my blood and my heart and my commitment to giving them everything I have. You can't buy that with all of Samuel Henderson's money." Pemberton stood as well, his expression hardening. "Nevertheless, the law is clear. These children are entitled to their inheritance. If they choose to come with us—" "If we choose?" Annie's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Everyone turned to look at her. "You keep talking about us like we're not here, like we're property to be claimed or prizes to be won. But we're people. We have voices. And maybe you should listen to what we actually want instead of arguing about what you think is best for us." Pemberton had the decency to look abashed. "Of course. Miss Henderson, what do you want?" Annie looked at Jonas, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. "I want to stay here. With Papa. This is my home. These are my people. And I don't care about money or fancy schools or grandfather who couldn't be bothered to know us when it mattered." "You're 15. Webb said gently. "You might feel differently when you're older. This money could give you opportunities you can't even imagine right now." "I can imagine them just fine," Annie shot back. "And they don't matter compared to what I have here. Papa taught me that some things are worth more than money or status or what other people think is proper. Family is worth more. Love is worth more. Home is worth more." All eyes turned to Eli. The boy stood silent, his expression torn. Jonas's heart clenched. Eli was 16, old enough to understand what was being offered, old enough to see both sides clearly. Can I think about it? Eli asked finally. It's a lot to process. Pemberton nodded. Of course, we're staying at the hotel in Prescott. Take a few days. Discuss it with Mr. Hale. But understand that this offer won't remain open indefinitely. The estate needs to be settled. After the lawyers left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the cabin. Annie stormed to her loft, her footsteps heavy on the ladder. Jonas and Eli stood in the main room, not looking at each other. You should consider it, Jonas said finally. It's a real opportunity. Don't. Eli's voice was tight. Don't do that. Don't make it easier for me to leave by pretending you don't care. I care. God knows I care. But I'm not going to be selfish about this, Eli. That money could give you and Annie a future I never could. What future? Eli turned to face him, anger and pain warring in his expression. A future where I wear fancy suits and pretend to be someone I'm not? Where I forget where I came from and who raised me? Where I abandon you because some dead grandfather decided to buy my loyalty with his fortune? It's not about loyalty. It's exactly about loyalty. Eli's voice rose. You stood for us when no one else would. You bled for us. You became our father when we needed one most. And now you're telling me to consider abandoning you for money? What kind of lesson is that? Jonas felt his own anger rising to meet Eli's. The kind that puts your future ahead of my feelings. I'm thinking about what's best for you, not what's easiest for me. And what if I get to decide what's best for me? What if I know better than anyone what I need? Eli's hands were shaking. I'm 16 years old. In 2 years, I'll be a legal adult. I can stay here, work this ranch, build a life in Montana Territory. Or I can go to Philadelphia and become someone I'm not to please people who never cared about me when it mattered. Tell me, Papa, which future do you really think is better? The use of Papa nearly broke Jonas. He sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. I just don't want you to have regrets, he said quietly. Don't want you looking back in 10 years and resenting me for not pushing you toward opportunities you deserved. Eli sat beside him. The only regret I'd have is leaving you. This ranch, this life, it's hard work and sometimes it's brutal. But it's real, it's mine. I've earned it with my own sweat and blood. That money? That's someone else's legacy. Someone who didn't care enough about Pa to reconcile when he was alive. Why would I want to inherit his guilt along with his fortune? They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Jonas spoke. What about Annie? She's only 15. She deserves better than what? Than being raised by a man who loves her? Than having a home where she's safe and valued? Than living in a place where she can rescue every injured animal she finds and no one tells her it's improper for a young lady? Eli shook his head. Annie's already decided. You heard her, and I have too. We're staying. This is our home. You're our father. Money doesn't change that. Jonas felt tears burning his eyes. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The next morning, Jonas and the children rode into Prescott together. They found Pemberton and Webb at the hotel, preparing documents at a corner table. We've made our decision, Eli said without preamble. We're declining the inheritance. Pemberton's eyebrows rose. All of it? Young man, do you understand what you're refusing? $200,000 could make us rich but not happy, Eli interrupted. Could give us opportunities but take away the life we've built. Could make us into different people than the ones our parents raised us to be. He glanced at Jonas. Our real father, the one who stood between us and death. He taught us that some things matter more than money. Family matters more. Love matters more. Home matters more. Miss Henderson? Webb looked at Annie. You agree with this decision? Completely, Annie said firmly. I don't want grandfather's money. I want the life I have, the family I have. That's worth more than all the money in the world. Pemberton leaned back in his chair, studying them with an expression Jonas couldn't quite read. You know, in 30 years of practicing law, I've never seen anyone turn down this kind of inheritance. Most people would take the money without a second thought. Then most people don't understand what matters, Eli said simply. The attorney was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. I'll need you both to sign documents formally declining the inheritance. The estate will then pass to the charitable foundation Samuel Henderson established. But I should tell you, there's a provision in the will I didn't mention yesterday." Jonas tensed. "What provision?" If the grandchildren declined the inheritance, Samuel Henderson wanted them to know he was proud of them. He wrote a letter to be delivered only under these circumstances. Pemberton pulled an envelope from his satchel. He predicted you might refuse the money. Said if you did, it meant his son had raised his children right, and that was worth more than any fortune. Eli took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single page, written in elegant script. "Read it aloud," Annie requested. "Please." Eli cleared his throat and began to read. "To my grandchildren, whom I never had the courage to meet. If you are reading this, you have refused the inheritance I offered as penance for my failures. Good. It means my son succeeded where I failed. He taught you that principle matters more than profit, that family matters more than fortune. I was a hard man who built an empire but destroyed a relationship with the only child I loved. John left because I valued business over people, money over morals. He was right to go, and I was too proud to admit it until too late. I tried to find him over the years, learned he'd married and had children, but could never bring myself to reach out. Pride is a poison that kills slowly but thoroughly. If you have refused this money, it means you understand what I learned too late. That wealth without love is poverty, that success without family is failure. Live well, love deeply. Build lives that matter not because of what you own, but because of who you are and who you love. Your loving but failed grandfather, Samuel Henderson." The letter fell silent. Eli's hands shook as he folded it carefully and returned it to the envelope. Annie was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. "He understood," she whispered. "At the end, he understood." "He did," Pemberton agreed. "And he left one final provision. The estate will establish a trust fund that you can access when you're older, if you need it. Not the full inheritance, that goes to charity as specified, but enough to ensure you have security if circumstances change. $10,000 each, held in trust until you turn 21. You can't refuse it. It's already established and legal. Consider it his way of ensuring his grandchildren have a safety net, even if they don't need his fortune." Jonas started to protest, but Eli put a hand on his arm. "We'll accept it. Not because we need it, but because it's his way of saying he's sorry. And everyone deserves the chance to apologize, even if it comes too late to matter." They signed the documents, shook hands with the lawyers, and walked out of the hotel into the bright Montana morning. For a long moment they stood on the wooden sidewalk, letting the reality settle over them. $200,000, Annie said wonderingly. "We just turned down $200,000. "And I'd do it again," Eli said firmly. "Every time." Jonas pulled them both close. "I'm proud of you, both of you. Not many people would have made that choice." "You taught us," Annie said simply. "You taught us what matters." They rode back to Cottonwood Ridge in companionable silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that only exists between people who know each other deeply and completely. The ranch spread before them as they crested the final ridge, their cabin with its smoking chimney, the barn and corrals, the fields they'd worked together, the cottonwood trees that gave the place its name. Home. Not because of money or inheritance or blood legacy, but because they'd built it together with their own hands and hearts. That evening, they held a quiet ceremony by the creek where Jonas had first found Annie hiding all those years ago. They burned Samuel Henderson's letter, not out of disrespect, but as a way of releasing the past. The old man's words had been important, his apology meaningful, but they didn't define who Eli and Annie were or would become. "To Ma and Pa," Eli said, holding Annie's hand as they watched the paper curl and blacken in the small fire. "You raised us right. You taught us what matters, and we're going to keep living by those lessons every day of our lives." "To family," Annie added, looking at Jonas with eyes full of love. "The family we were born to and the family we found. Both matter. Both made us who we are." Jonas watched the flames consume the letter, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over him. 3 years ago, a bleeding boy had collapsed on his porch and changed everything. In standing between that boy and evil, Jonas had found redemption he didn't know he was seeking. He'd found purpose and love, and a reason to be better than the broken soldier he'd become. The fire burned down to embers as the Montana evening settled around them. They walked back to the cabin together, Eli talking about his plans to expand the herd next spring, Annie describing a new book she wanted to order from Prescott. Ordinary conversations about an ordinary life. And yet to Jonas, it felt extraordinary. After all the violence and loss, after all the blood and tears, they'd arrived at something precious, a family bound not by obligation or circumstance, but by choice. 6 months later, in the autumn of 1878, Jonas stood on that same porch where everything had begun. The leaves on the cottonwood trees had turned to gold, carpeting the ground in color. Eli was out riding fence line, now 17 and looking every inch the rancher he'd become. Annie was in the barn with her menagerie, nursing a fox kit she'd found with a broken leg. Sheriff Brennan rode up with his usual cloud of dust, but this time his face bore good news. "Wanted you to hear it from me first," he said, dismounting with a grin. "The territorial government is establishing a new protection program for homesteaders, patrols, legal advocates, oversight on land disputes, all because of what happened to the Hendersons. Your stand at Cottonwood Ridge changed things, Jonas, made people realize these patterns of fraud and violence had to stop." Jonas absorbed this in silence. 15 families had suffered under Blackwood's scheme. The Hendersons had paid the ultimate price. But from that tragedy, change had come. Justice had found root in harsh soil. "That's good," Jonas said finally. "Real good." "There's something else." Brennan pulled out an official-looking document. "The territorial governor wants to award you a commendation for bravery. Ceremony in Helena next month. They want you there. Want to tell your story." Jonas looked at the document without taking it. "I don't need a commendation, Tom. I did what any decent man would do." "That's exactly why you deserve it. Because you don't see what you did as extraordinary. But it was, Jonas. You stood alone against 5 killers. You protected 2 children at the cost of your own safety. You showed people that one man with courage can make a difference." Brennan pressed the document into Jonas's hands. "Come to Helena. Let them honor you. Not for your sake, but for all the other men out there who need to see that doing the right thing matters." Jonas thought about refusing. Thought about staying here in his comfortable anonymity, avoiding the spotlight and attention. But then he thought about John Henderson, who'd stood against Blackwood knowing it might cost everything. About Sarah Henderson, who died protecting her children. About all the other families who'd suffered in silence. "All right," he said. "I'll come." The ceremony in Helena was bigger than Jonas had expected. The territorial capital was crowded with officials, reporters, and citizens who'd heard the story of Cottonwood Ridge. Jonas stood on a platform in his best clothes, still simple ranch wear but clean and pressed, while the governor spoke about courage and sacrifice and the Montana spirit. Eli and Annie stood beside him, also dressed in their best. Annie's hand found Jonas's as the governor talked about the night a bleeding boy had knocked on a stranger's door and changed 3 lives forever. "Jonas Hale could have turned them away," the governor said. "Could have saved himself by letting evil have its way. Instead, he stood. He fought. He bled. And in doing so, he saved not just 2 children, but showed us all what Montana Territory should be. A place where good men stand against evil, where family matters more than profit, where courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it." The crowd applauded. Jonas accepted the commendation, a bronze medal that felt heavy in his palm. But what mattered more was the look in Eli's and Annie's eyes. Pride. Love. The certainty that they'd made the right choice in staying, in building their life at Cottonwood Ridge. After the ceremony, people crowded around wanting to shake Jonas's hand, to hear the story firsthand. He answered their questions with characteristic brevity, always deflecting credit back to the children's courage, to Sheriff Brennan's quick response, to the community that had helped rebuild. But one conversation stood out. A young homesteader, maybe 25, with his wife and infant child, approached Jonas nervously. "Mr. Hale? I just wanted to say thank you. We were about to give up our land claim. A man came by last month saying we owed money on taxes we knew we'd paid. After hearing your story, after seeing what you did, we decided to fight. Went to the new territorial advocate, and turns out it was fraud. Same scheme Blackwood ran. We could have lost everything. Your stand at Cottonwood Ridge saved us too, in a way. Jonas shook the man's hand, feeling the weight of that responsibility. How many families had been saved because he'd refused to let evil pass unchallenged? How many children would grow up with their parents because one broken soldier had remembered how to fight for something that mattered? You saved yourselves, Jonas said. You chose to stand. That's what matters. The journey back to Cottonwood Ridge took 2 days, and they filled the time with easy conversation and comfortable silence. On the evening of the second day, they crested the ridge and saw their ranch spread below them in the golden light of sunset. Home, Annie said softly, and the word carried everything, relief and joy, and the bone-deep satisfaction of returning to the place you belonged. They rode down together, 3 people bound by choice and love, and the shared knowledge that they'd survived the worst the world could throw at them, and come out stronger on the other side. That night, after the horses were bedded down and the animals fed and the cabin warm with firelight, they gathered around the table for supper. It was a simple meal, venison stew and bread, nothing fancy, but it tasted like everything good in the world. Papa? Annie said as they were finishing. Can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever regret it? Taking us in that night? Everything that happened after? Jonas looked at his daughter, because that's what she was, in every way that mattered, and then at Eli, who was watching him with the same question in his eyes. Never, Jonas said firmly, not for 1 second. That night changed everything. It gave me back my life, gave me purpose and meaning and a reason to be better than I was. You two saved me just as much as I saved you, maybe more. But you lost so much, Eli said quietly. Your solitude, your peace, I lost nothing that mattered, Jonas interrupted. And I gained everything. You want to know what I think about when I look back on that night? They both nodded. I think about how close I came to turning Eli away. How easy it would have been to tell a bleeding boy that I couldn't help, that he should try the next ranch over. How I almost let fear and old wounds keep me from doing what needed doing. Jonas paused, his voice thick with emotion. And then I think about everything I would have missed if I'd made that choice. Watching you both grow up, teaching you to ride and shoot and read the weather, hearing Annie's stories and seeing Eli's skill with the horses, being called Papa, having a family again after years of being alone. He looked around the cabin, at the drawings Annie had made hanging on the walls, at the tack Eli had mended with careful hands, at the life they'd built together from ashes and determination. The fire at Cottonwood Ridge took my old cabin, Jonas continued, took the isolation I'd built around myself. Took the man I was and forced me to become someone different, someone better. And I'm grateful for every flame, every drop of blood, every moment of terror and pain, because it brought us here, together. Family. Annie was crying now, the kind of healing tears that wash away old hurt and make room for joy. She moved around the table and hugged Jonas fiercely. Eli joined them, and for a long moment they stood there in their warm cabin, 3 people who'd found each other in darkness and chosen to build something beautiful in the light. Outside, the Montana night settled over Cottonwood Ridge. The wind whispered through the cottonwood trees that gave the place its name, carrying stories of courage and sacrifice, of love and redemption, of one man who'd remembered how to stand when standing mattered most. The wolves howled in the distance, but their cries held no menace now. They were just part of the Montana symphony, wild and free and beautiful in their own way, like everything else in this harsh and magnificent territory. Jonas Hale had come to Montana seeking isolation and peace. Instead, he'd found violence and terror and a test of everything he believed about himself. He'd been forced to become a killer again, to break the vow he'd made and shed blood he'd sworn never to shed. But from that violence came something precious. 2 children who needed someone to stand between them and evil. 2 orphans who became his son and daughter. 2 lives he'd saved who had, in turn, saved his own. The fire at Cottonwood Ridge had burned away everything Jonas thought he wanted and left him with everything he needed. Family, purpose, love. A reason to face each new day, not with dread, but with hope. Years later, when Eli married a young woman from Prescott and Annie became a teacher in the territorial schools, Jonas would stand at their weddings with tears of pride in his eyes. When grandchildren came, children who called him Grandpa and listened wide-eyed to his stories, he would hold them with gentle hands and teach them the same lessons he'd taught their parents. That courage meant standing up when it mattered, that family was worth more than fortune, that some things, love, loyalty, honor, couldn't be bought or sold, only earned through the daily choice to show up and care and fight for what mattered most. And on quiet evenings, when the Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of fire and the cottonwood trees whispered their eternal song, Jonas Hale would sit on his porch and think about the bleeding boy who'd changed everything. About the little girl hiding by the creek, about the choice he'd made to stand instead of hide, to fight instead of flee, to love instead of isolate. It had cost him peace and safety and the comfortable numbness of isolation. It had given him everything worth having. The fire at Cottonwood Ridge had taken his old life and forged a new one from the ashes. And Jonas Hale, father, protector, the man who'd stood between innocence and evil and somehow survived, wouldn't change a single moment of it, not for all the peace in the world, not for all the safety money could buy, not for anything. Because some things were worth every flame, every drop of blood, every sleepless night haunted by memories of violence. Some things were worth dying for. And some things, like the sound of his children's laughter echoing across the valley, like the warmth of family gathered around a table, like the simple satisfaction of a life lived with purpose and love. Some things were worth living for. Jonas Hale had learned the difference, and in learning it, he'd found redemption for all the ghosts that had haunted him, peace for all the wars he'd fought, and love for all the loneliness he'd endured. The Montana Territory stretched vast and endless around Cottonwood Ridge, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving. But within the walls of one cabin, 3 people who'd found each other in tragedy had built something stronger than stone and more lasting than steel. They'd built a home. They'd built a family. They'd built a life worth the living. And as the stars came out over Montana and the fire crackled in the hearth, and his children settled in for another peaceful night, Jonas Hale closed his eyes with a smile on his face and gratitude in his heart. He'd stood when it mattered. He'd fought when fighting was necessary. He'd loved when love seemed impossible. And in the end, that made all the difference. The fire at Cottonwood Ridge was over. The ashes had cooled, and from them had grown something beautiful, a family forged in violence but sustained by love, tested by tragedy but strengthened by choice, broken by loss but healed by the simple daily act of showing up for each other. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.